Hello and welcome to the first Mayday C4 event, a climate change conference. My name is Russell Mills and I chair Help Rescue the Planet. Help Rescue the Planet is an educational charity dedicated to minimising air pollution and mitigating climate change. We are delighted that you are joining in with this conference and look forward to receiving your valued input. Today's conference is about the price of natural capital. I will now hand you over to the organiser of the Mayday C4 events, Dr. Robin Russell-Jones. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell, and good morning, everybody. In order to begin to tackle climate change, we need to do four things. Firstly, we need to get the science right. A lot of people are not very happy about the IPCC's use of global warming potentials, and it is, of course, the global warming potentials that underlie the nationally determined contributions. So that is the subject of day two. The second thing we need to do is we need to put a price on carbon globally, and the best proposal that's come up is the Global Carbon Incentive Fund, and that's going to be the subject of day three of this conference. The third thing we need to do is get a hold on population. When I was born, population of the planet was just over 2.5 billion. It's now over 7.7 billion and going up every day. That is unsustainable. Population of the world has gone up more than 3 times in my lifetime. The planet simply cannot sustain that level of increase. We're not going to discuss that particular aspect in this conference because it's probably the most difficult one to deal with. So we're leaving that until the last Mayday C4 event in October. The main topic of today is we have to get away from the idea that ever increasing GDP is the only possible definition of progress. GDP is an amoral construct. If you're a drug dealer, you add to GDP. If you cut down a forest, you do nothing to GDP. Conventional economic models ignore the plundering of the Earth's natural resources. And conventional economic models treat the oceans as a dumping ground for plastic and the atmosphere as a dumping ground for greenhouse gases. They call them externalities, as if they are peripheral to the main purpose of the economy, which is to generate profits. There are 2 problems with this approach. Firstly, they're not externalities, they're actually central to our survival and indeed the survival of every other species on the planet. Secondly, they've not been left out by chance, they've been left out deliberately because the greedy people who drew up the conventional economic model originally perceived that they would make a bit more profit or a lot more profit by plundering the world's resources at cost. And of course, they didn't have to pay for polluting our rivers, our oceans, and our atmosphere, and for rendering species extinct. In other words, the conventional economic model is amoral, or perhaps it should be described as morally indefensible. And of course, when you can accept this model, it introduces all sorts of distortions into the market. Climate change and air pollution are the twin monsters that arise from the burning of fossil fuels. But the cost of burning fossil fuels to society, according to the IMF, is $5.3 trillion a year. Since we emit 36.6 billion tons of CO2 a year, that works out at $145 per ton of CO2. So the fossil fuel industry is being subsidized to the tune of $145 per ton of CO2. So when they say that renewables can only function if they are subsidized, they don't mention all the hidden costs that are actually propping up the fossil fuel industry. So all the speakers today are addressing different aspects of this existential dilemma. Who gave us the right to plunder the planet? And who gave industry the right to pollute the planet? Becky Willabore will address a mechanism for putting a price on natural resources. This was an important development that was contained in Professor Dasgupta's report from Cambridge University and has been echoed by people such as Kathy Willis from Oxford, who works closely with Becky Willebore, who is the Director of Research at the NatCap Research Institute. Peter Head will address the mechanism for maintaining the sustainability of our most precious asset, the soil. And Sean Spears will address the question as to how this approach can be incorporated into COP26. So Becky's presentation is pre-recorded, so she won't be able to answer questions, but the other two speakers are live. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Becky Willebore. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to speak to you this morning. So I will give you a little overview of what we do. So I'm, to introduce myself, I'm head of research at a company called Natural Capital Research. The company itself was set up a couple of years ago by Professor Kathy Willis and Professor Sir Dieter Helm, really born out of a frustration with a lot of people trying to do natural capital, but in a way that they felt they were not doing natural capital well. And so they set up the company with myself and a colleague initially just to set the bar, to do natural capital well, to do it in a robust way, and to do it in the way that they felt it should be done. And so I'll show you a little bit about what we do, and then also think about the framing behind natural capital and how we might think about pricing it. And as I'm the first speaker, I'm going to start with some definitions. So I don't know what was discussed in the previous session, but I'll give you a definition of natural capital anyway. Natural capital, our understanding of it is natural capital are the elements of nature, the assets of nature that provide essential ecosystem services to society. So this is a slide of a framing that was set out by the Natural Capital Committee, the government's Natural Capital Committee in the UK. And what you can see is that it's split into three sections. So natural capital, we start with the assets, and we would always advocate an asset-based approach. And this will be really important when we're thinking about valuation in a moment. But the assets of natural capital are the things that are actually there on the ground that can be measured. So these are your species, your communities, landscapes. It's also your soils, your water, your air. It would include minerals as well. Oil and gas do come into this. They are assets as well. And we can think about these assets in terms of their quantity, how much of each one we have, their quality, so are they in good condition or poor condition, and their spatial configuration, which is incredibly important when we're thinking about natural systems, because these are not isolated units, they come in systems and need to be thought about in systems. But those are our assets. From those assets flow ecosystem services, so they provide functions which we as humans find beneficial. So this is a very human-centric view of nature, deliberately so. But these services are things like pollination, the sequestration of CO2 from the atmosphere, soil erosion protection, flood risk reduction, clean water provision, these kinds of things, and habitats for thriving biodiversity. And of course, then those functions themselves eventually can become benefits to society, which we can value. So pollinated crops, for example, the provision of clean air or clean water. So this is the framework, and I'm going to use this language throughout. So the assets, the stocks, then the flows of services that come from those, which eventually turn into benefits to society. And it's really, really key, and the Natural Capital Committee have been very clear on this, it's very key to take an asset-based approach. So when we're thinking about the valuation of capital or the quantification of natural capital, we focus on those assets and not the flows. Because valuing and maximizing the flows could fail to address unsustainable of assets. So you might try, for example, to maximize the extraction of timber or fish or land for recreation, how many people you can fit onto that land. And that in itself might lead to the degradation of the asset. So we're not interested in valuing the flows per se. At the fundamental level, we should start with those assets. And really, this is about managing assets in perpetuity for future generations and making sure that they are in conditions that can allow these services to flow continually into the future. That's the framing. I'll give you a quick example of what we would do if we were doing a natural capital assessment and trying to understand what natural capital a particular landowner or company might have. So we start with a baseline, and this is another critical step. So you can't value it if you don't know what you've got. So always, you need to start with a baseline, understand what is there, and from that you can think about how it might be improved or how it might be valued or how you might report it over time. And again, the Natural Capital Committee are really clear on this as well. Always start with a baseline, understand what you have, and from there you can then look at improvements or valuing it if you want to. So I give you an example of what a baseline looks like, because it's all quite theoretical stuff. So here is actually White Woods in Oxford, a randomly chosen area. But here we're looking at assets, one type of asset, which is land cover. So we have an aerial photograph on the left-hand side and a land cover map on the right-hand side. And you see that we've broken it down into broad habitat categories. So we're starting to think about, well, where are the woodlands? Where are the grasslands? Where are the hedgerows, which is really key in the UK? Trees outside of woodlands, all those little purple splotches. Where are the wetlands and so on? So we start with that and we think about what condition they're in, what spatial configuration, what extent. And then we can start to model the flows. And this is what we do as a company, is that we take the best available peer-reviewed science and try to understand what these flows are from that natural capital. So here's an example for carbon. So we're using a lot of remote sensing data and aerial photography and so on to get a really clear understanding of where is the carbon in those woodlands. So darker colors, more carbon. So we're starting to think about, what are the trees currently doing? How much carbon is stored in those trees? If you were to cut them down, how much would they contribute to climate change, for example, if you were to burn them? And again, in hedgerows as well, because in the UK, it's really key that we think about hedgerows and not just the woodlands themselves. That's carbon. You can do the same with rates of change over time and sequestration, but I'm not going to bore you with lots of details. But you can see that you start to break this down in really fine spatial scale. So any particular person who's making decisions about the environment can now start to see where on the landscape are the key bits of natural capital for certain services, carbon or biodiversity or water or whatever it might be. And you can layer all those up and think about multiple functions. So we're not just trying to look at this through one lens. I think this is one of the risks with natural capital, is that we think about it in terms of climate change, which is an element of natural capital, and we think about carbon. But of course, if you try to maximize carbon in a landscape, then you'll end up with a lot of Sitka spruce and not a great deal of biodiversity. So you really have to think about these things in the round. We have a platform that does this called NatCap Map. If you were interested, then that launched a couple of weeks ago. So there's more details about that online. But we'll skip through there. Okay, so once you have that baseline, then you can think about what you might do to improve your natural capital. And this is where we start to think about how you can enhance the value of natural capital that is already there. And again, if we were to think about the opportunities, and a lot of landowners are thinking now, well, what can I do to improve the value of my natural capital and harness some of the incoming markets? So voluntary carbon markets is one. ELMS payments will be providing public money for public goods, though we're not clear exactly what that will look like yet. Nature recovery networks, biodiversity net gain is another potential market that relates to natural capital. And there are others as well. So water companies are looking at reverse auctions, paying landowners to reduce their inputs into the land, green bonds. There's a huge range, and there's a massive opportunity here for a lot of people to understand how they can really get paid for doing good things to the environment. And the question is, how do you harness that and how do you maximize those income streams? And this is where we're thinking about the value. Where I was talking about, it's important that you and natural capital is there current. You should be things that's in perpetuity and the maintenance cost of just keeping those assets in good condition. This element of valuation is that enhancement on top of that. And this is where we're starting to harness private money as well and private markets to pay for that gain. And it's a marginal thing. So this is about marginal improvements in carbon stores, for example, which you can then price because they have a market for them. But it's not about pricing all the carbon in the landscape, that if you were to run it all the way down to zero, that it would always have the same price all the way down. I'll give you, so time is short and I don't want to bore you, but I'll give you one scenario just to, as an example of how you might enhance natural capital and how you might value that. So tree planting in the UK is a huge issue at the moment, lots strong political drive for it, and a lot of people are very interested in this. The question is, what should you do? What is the right tree in the right place to maximize natural capital? So we can think about how trees sequester carbon over time, and we can relate this to the Woodland Carbon Code and other markets that will price carbon per ton of CO2 equivalent that can be sequestered. And that's fine, those markets exist. And if you were to plant new trees in the UK, you could sell those as offsets for companies to offset their own emissions. But this isn't just about carbon. So to make sure we're not having adverse impacts on other elements of nature, then we should also think about which trees we're planting and where. So one of the things that we would consider looking at would be the connectivity of a landscape. So planting the right trees that are good for biodiversity, and then planting them in specific locations that would connect up existing woodlands and start to build in corridors and larger woodland patches that then promote biodiversity as well. And so that's an element of modeling that you can do called graph theory. It thinks about the landscape as if it were a transport network and trying to link up all the different nodes. But ultimately, you're just trying to make functional landscapes rather than isolated units. So that's how we would think about value. So not just about the carbon price that would be driving the intervention for a particular landowner, but then also where to put that to get the most benefit for the other elements of natural capital as well. It's probably enough to get a conversation going, so I will stop there and then hand over to the next speaker.
So that was a very illuminating account of how one puts a price on natural capital, or how one begins to start to do that. As I said, that was pre-recorded, so Becky, unfortunately, is not available to answer questions, but you can certainly send in questions to the panel on the chat function, and then the most appropriate questions will be passed on to the panel. So feel free to start posting questions at any stage in the proceedings. Our next speaker, gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Peter Head. Peter is a bit of a polymath. I mean, he's a civil and structural engineer originally and has worked with companies such as Arup. And in 1998, he was awarded an OBE for his work on the second Severn crossing into Wales. But he's also been awarded a CBE for his services to civil engineering and the environment. In April 2011, he set up the Ecological Sequestration Trust, of which he is still the CEO. Interestingly, I started Help Rescue the Planet the same year, so we're obviously decided that we ought to try and do something about climate change because the politicians were making such a hash of it. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Peter. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Robin. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'll just share my screen and then start my presentation. So thank you very much. And I'm going to talk about sequestering much more carbon dioxide into soils as part of our net zero carbon strategic approach. And I'm going to do it in a way, as Becky has introduced, that actually deals with increasing natural capital as well. So I'm not just going to talk about carbon dioxide. As Robin has said, I always thought that working with biological systems is the way to tackle climate change, and that's why I set up my charity in 2011 and called it the Ecological Sequestration Trust. And I must admit, a lot of people at the time thought that was a crazy title for a charity, but hopefully it seems a little bit more relevant to everyone now. Joe Biden has adopted a rural plan to make agriculture net to zero emissions, because otherwise agriculture will be the biggest emitter once grid decarbonisation and electrification is complete. So it's preparing for that later stage of the process. It can be a win-win for farmers, giving them much more revenue from increased crop production, and of course receipt of carbon credits, as Becky has introduced just now. I'm going to start with an introduction to our work at Resilience Brokers, which is the operating company of my trust, and also a one-year-old pivot project program, which I'll explain in a minute. Soil sequestration needs a systems approach, and I'll show how we're building a systems modeling and artificial intelligence tool for communities around the world to use. Then I'll show you how it can be used in the UK to further our net zero carbon plans, linked to the new UK agricultural bill. Healthier soils absorb much more carbon, retain more moisture, grow more food, and help ecology to flourish and improve our resilience. And that's what natural capital increase is all about, really. I'm going to show you 5 big innovations that we could roll out quickly with new business models. And we're hoping in my charity that we can work with you to roll these out in our demonstration regions around the UK as part of pivot projects. When COVID impacted in March 2020, just over a year ago, we realized that it was going to change everything. We brought together a team of sector systems experts and volunteers from around the world to build an artificial intelligence-driven systems model for public and private sector partnership innovation. With this, you can test a range of investment scenarios for getting faster to net zero. The hope in pivot projects was to create new jobs and reduce future pandemic risk. 500 people around the world have now signed up to this mission, all working voluntarily. We're helping to build collective intelligence with collaborative partnerships across all sectors that are listed here. We work online and have started supporting regional test beds through living labs, and the first of those is actually in Exeter in the UK. People all over the world have told us that they don't want to go back. And the ideas that have emerged are illustrated here. These are the sort of big transformational ideas. People want clean air. They want more decentralized, affordable, renewable energy. They want water and waste systems. Many parts of the world, only 50% of the world's population have access to washing facilities for washing hands. And they want a regenerative economic model in which people live closer to nature. This means regenerative land and ocean farming is a key part of the recovery, and sequestering carbon really is a fundamental part of regenerative agriculture. We're working on how to roll out all these changes as systems solutions, and I'm going to focus on regenerative agriculture practice today, but I could have presented on a number of other different subjects listed here. I'm going to start by showing you the way we've developed systems mapping and put those maps into an AI engine to enable rapid searches for systems solutions, which can be done in hours rather than weeks and months. The key to regenerative agriculture is to look at urban and rural systems and how resources can be shared and managed to improve food resilience, lower costs, and reduce carbon emissions. You can see in our Kumu mapping how these are connected through 4 black workstream nodes, including infrastructure, to a large range of factors, including air quality and carbon emissions. As we zoom out, you can see more and more of the 400 plus aspects that the workstreams have connected up. You can see the selected word on the left with all the connected references. Now, jumping to a carbon, you can see immediately how it connects to air pollution, and through the work streams connects to many other relevant activities, including jobs. As we zoom out again, you can see the complexity and understand how it's really important to use AI to help us understand where the virtuous circles of benefit are as we explore different recovery scenarios from COVID. The Spark Beyond artificial intelligence engine that we're programming accesses billions of web pages and open research reports looking for systems link innovations. And you can see the beginning of our search here for soil sequestration in agriculture, which informed this presentation. You can look for what aspects influence sequestration of carbon in soils, including their type, their moisture content, nutrients, ecology, biodiversity, and so on. We found, as an example, that root structures in soils are much more important than things like leaf litter and other compost in terms of carbon management, which is not what I thought, I must admit, when I started. So now I'll move on and tell you about our findings for how we can make our soils healthier and how through land management they can be made to absorb much more carbon dioxide. I'm going to outline the potential in terms of carbon dioxide sequestered per year in relation to the path to net zero. Soil is a biological system that's full of microorganisms. If we allow the microorganisms to build in healthy soils, their ability to decompose organic matter and create humus increases over time. In turn, this releases nutrients for plants, roots, and fungi to flourish, and hence the soil's ability to absorb organic matter and sequester carbon dioxide increases. Building soil organic matter is a win-win for food and climate change. If we allow soils to degrade and be washed away, soils become net emitters of carbon dioxide, which obviously we don't want. So keeping the soils in place is really critical for our resilience. The chemistry is complex. The supply of nitrogen is key to enable sequestration to proceed, for example. Continuous application of pesticides may threaten the processes of soil microorganisms, and so a holistic systems approach is needed. And I think this is one of the big reasons why Joe Biden has taken the decision he has, because soils in America have become very degraded over the last 20 years. There's no doubt that resilience for big changes in agricultural practice are needed. And we're going to see a huge transformation, I think, in farming practice. Here's the estimated amount of carbon dioxide stored in soils globally at different depths, up to 2 meters. The total amount of carbon stored in the top 2 layers of soil is 2,400 gigatons, which actually is more than in all vegetation and the atmosphere put together. That shows you how important soils are. We urgently need to allow the carbon to build back and obviously keep the carbon we've got where it is. The UK Climate Change Committees recognise that an overhaul of the land and agricultural sectors is essential to meet the UK net zero carbon outcome, and has recognised the need for a high uptake of low carbon farming practices, and also releasing 22% of land out of traditional agricultural production for long-term carbon sequestration. The agricultural land area we have in the UK is 5 million hectares, and the area of grass much bigger at 11 million hectares. The CCC report shows that the current net emissions from land has net 60 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per year, which will be the largest contribution to UK emissions once decarbonisation of energy systems is complete. Through regenerative agriculture and forestry, the CCC estimate that it could come down to a net 20 million tonnes per year, but not the net zero planned by the USA. In the further ambition column, you can see the orange contribution from agroforestry, hedges and energy crops of 8 million tonnes of CO2 sequestered per year from a total of 5 million hectares of land. The new UK agricultural bill is now law and has a focus in improving soil health. It envisages regenerative agriculture, including set-aside no-till systems, cover crops, agroforestry and crop rotation for arable farms, and holistic livestock grazing on grassland as methods to improve food resilience and also helping to sequester more carbon. Also, improved peat management is also mentioned as being very important. I'll tell you what research shows these have to offer quantitatively for sequestration, assuming farmers also address nitrogen and pesticide management, as I mentioned earlier. There are some additional so-called frontier technologies like biochar, which I'm not going to cover today, but they can come in as well if we want them to. So I'm largely focusing on 5 well-proven technologies which are ready for scale-up. So let's look at the 5 innovations that could help the UK get to net zero land use emissions. We use systems mapping and the AI Research Studio to help guide us towards these solutions, many of which are already proven at small scale in the UK, but there are 1 or 2 surprising ones which you may not have heard of. The good thing about the 5 big solutions is that they're all mutually supportive and additive, so really big transformations are going to be possible. They require investment, of course, but with increased revenues guaranteed, new business models are emerging quickly to support them, including the possibility of using green bonds. And as Becky has told us, valuing natural capital could emerge as a big driver too. Agroforestry is an attractive and promising option for additional carbon sequestration on agricultural land because it can sequester significant amounts of carbon while leaving the bulk of land for agricultural production. The tree components and hedges in agroforestry systems can be significant sinks of atmospheric carbon due to their fast growth and high productivity, and they substantially increase biodiversity, as Becky mentioned, and help minimize pests and diseases. Silvo-arable systems involve the planned use of the land for concurrent production of agricultural crops, including tree crops. Trees and hedges reduce soil loss in storms and help the build-up of underground root and fungus systems. The photographs here are from UK trials. Silvopastoral is the manufacture of woody plants mutual with animal pasture. The trees and shrubs may be used first and foremost to produce fodder for livestock, or they may be grown for timber, fuel wood, or fruit to improve the soil qualities, and also it provides animal shelter. It's a very flexible system, and it's really, there's a lot of people exploring it all over the world. Both arable and pastoral methods have been shown to store overground and underground at least an additional 0.5 ton of carbon per hectare per year, which is 2 tons of CO2 sequestered per year per hectare. But it's quite a complex thing to manage and measure compared to other solutions, and clearly you've got to measure it in order to get the benefit. There is a lot of research going on in agroforestry all over the world right now. We're working in Kenya at the moment, and there's a huge interest there in moving it forward too. Now we come to no-till agriculture, with examples shown here of rapidly evolving UK practice using drilling machines for seeding and planting rather than ploughing. The main impetus for many farmers to reduce tillage is to mitigate soil erosion by not turning soil each year, with it being washed and blown away. Studies have reported highly significant reductions in soil erosion, often as much as 90%, which clearly is critical for long-term livelihoods. Many field studies and reviews have shown increases in soil organic carbon following adoption of reduced till and no-till agriculture. Success was found to depend on different soil textures and climates, so it's quite complicated. The typical figures are between 0.2 and 0.22 tons of carbon per year per hectare, about 0.5 to 0.8 tons of CO2 sequestered per year per hectare. You may be aware of the amazing work that's been done by Alan Savory in establishing and testing holistic grassland grazing management systems, which can sequester up to an additional 1 ton of carbon per hectare per year. He points out that if this was to be adopted across the globe at the rate of 1 ton of carbon per hectare, which is 4 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year, we could sequester 12 gigatons of carbon, 44 gigatons of CO2 per year, reducing CO2 in the atmosphere by as much as 6 parts per million per year. However, relying on this as a global solution, I think, would be rather dangerous as the management practices, but would have to be kept up on such a massive scale might be a bit challenging. In the UK, with 11 million hectares of grassland, it does have the potential to impact on reducing the 20 million tonnes per year shortfall by at least 20% if it was used on 10% of the area that has animals on it. Better management would also increase biodiversity. So it's an interesting opportunity. Now moving to something that may be completely new to some of you. Scientists in Norway have found that over the last 20 years, since CO2 levels increased significantly in the atmosphere, as the atmosphere has warmed up, the balance of negative and positive ions that rain down from the sun has changed in the northern hemisphere. This may be due to the increased depth of atmosphere that particles travel through, but scientists are not sure. But we know the outcome, as the ions used to be equal numbers of positive and negative ones 20 years ago. Now they're predominantly positive, which is not good for human and biological health. If you think about what you do, if you have asthma, you sit in front of a bath of negative ions to help you. It may be that the insect decline is partly linked to this, because insects are very sensitive to the electrical charge in the air. In soils, negative ions stimulate plant and microbe activity, and losing them means we need more fertilizer and water. So my fourth big solution is a new fertilizer replacement that can be made using local materials and can be sprayed onto crops with a negative charge attached to it in a patented process. This reduces transpiration, cools the soil in the summer, and stimulates root and biosystem activity. And in small-scale trials all over the world, including the UK, it's been found to double crop production rates compared to current growing methods. Carbon storage hasn't yet been measured, but I'm sure it will help the other solutions to work well and reduce emissions caused by fertilizers. This could contribute a very significant reduction of net emissions. My last big solution is agrivoltaics. In this, the farmer becomes an energy supplier using photovoltaic panels installed in fields. But instead of giving up the fields, the farmer can farm underneath with arable or pastoral methods combined with agroforestry, as long as the trees aren't too high. The clever thing is that the shading reduces soil transpiration, and so summer yields are found to go up and water demand goes down. So the farmer now gets revenue from the adjacent urban areas, both for food, but also for selling energy to them. And more carbon dioxide emissions are effectively offset by the fields. This is a very powerful systems win-win, which could further add to the net zero emissions outcome, and I think is set for huge take-up globally. Finally, the new business models that are rapidly emerging to drive these innovations forward. As an example I've given here, Indigo Agriculture, which is a Boston-based agri-tech startup, is starting to pay farmers to store carbon in soils in the UK as part of Joe Biden's initiative. Indigo told the FT that it hoped to sign up more than 3,000 growers covering more than 1 million acres this year in the USA on the back of the net zero carbon pledge. The farmers are going to be paid $15 for every ton of carbon dioxide that's stored underground, which isn't that much, but I guess this price will probably go up over time. It plans to sell the carbon credits that to offset companies' inherent emissions in the food and agricultural sector. So it's creating a sort of circular benefit to that sector. Farming practices I've already mentioned, such as minimal tilling of soil, planting cover crops in between main crops, are all part of the scheme. This is a potential new global market of at least $60 billion a year, maybe $20 to $30 million in the UK, to help us get to net zero agriculture. So I hope this has been a useful illustration of how systems mapping, artificial intelligence and new industry practices and technologies can help us get to net zero faster and build greater community resilience, improved health and well-being, and regeneration of biodiversity, all of those natural capital dimensions that Becky talked about. I conclude that, like the USA, setting a target for net zero emissions from land will be a great way forward, and we should encourage new startup companies and jobs linked to the transformation, because it will create a lot of jobs, these management systems. So we're set for a major change in agriculture and farming practice as anticipated in the Agriculture Bill. And at Pivot Projects, we're planning to help with this transformation and the many other pivots we need. And if any of you are interested, please get in touch by email or on Twitter, as shown on my last slide. So thank you very much for the invitation, Robin, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you all today.
Thank you, Peter. That was a very comprehensive analysis of the technologies that are available. I've had questions about what are the obstacles to these technologies being implemented. I'm thinking particularly of, what is the response of people like the National Farmers Union to these proposals? And I'm also thinking of the DEFRA document that was produced last year called Farming for the Future, which had 43 pages of aspiration about getting to net zero, but never once mentioned ammonia or nitrous oxide or methane or even particulates. So how can you have a strategy to get to net zero if you don't mention two of the most important greenhouse gases produced by agriculture?
So, sorry, Robin, you're asking for my comment on that?
Yes, I would really try to these are great proposals, but what are the obstacles for them being implemented in the UK or more widely?
Yeah, well, at the moment, I guess one of the obstacles is we haven't established a method for farmers to actually benefit from the changes. And I think the work that Becky's doing and the work that I've talked about will help all of that. It's really getting established practice for farmers reaping the benefits of making these changes happen. And I think that will help to drive change. There are already a lot of examples of change in practice in the UK on farms. And so there is already established knowledge and practice. And I know the farmers' unions are all very interested in it. But I think everyone is looking for a fairly comprehensive transformation plan, including how the funding is going to be raised and delivered in order to make the change happen. Clearly, farmers are under a lot of stress with climate change. They're all struggling to cope with, with these really dramatic cycles of change that we're getting, and therefore it's not easy for them to implement change. But I think if there are comprehensive both measurement methods and delivery methods, and I think probably we need to develop the measurement methodologies better as well, because they're running a bit behind. And I think the technologies for measuring soil carbon, but also nitrous oxide, methane, and other dimensions, which I didn't cover in my presentation, are really important as well. Nitrous oxide, particularly from fertilizers. So the alternative fertilizer I talked about will be a very powerful contribution in terms of reducing nitrous oxide.
You mean the one with the negative ion?
Yes, that's made out of recycled local materials as well.
So, so basically we need a business model that encourages farmers to store carbon in the soil. So how does the Indigo agriculture business model work? Who's funding it?
It's basically funded from voluntary contributions, which come from the farming sector. So a lot of food and agricultural companies in the US are committed to net zero practice, And so they're willing to bring forward voluntary contributions to fund farming practice. One of the big problems in the US is that soils are, there's probably only sort of 30, 40, 50 crop cycles left for the soils to survive at all. And so a lot of big food producers in the US are very worried about the resilience of their businesses. And so they're willing to support farmers to move in another direction, because otherwise they won't have practice in the future. So they're basically willing to fund farmers to change practice to make food production more resilient for the long term. And that's a new emerging sort of dynamic amongst the big global corporations.
So I mean that's interesting. I remember there's a chap called Craig Sams who runs Carbon Gold. It's a sort of biochar company that's designed to put carbon back into the soil. And he, from America, he said that when his ancestors first got to the plains of Wyoming, the carbon content of the soil was 100 grams per kilogram. And now, as a result of agricultural practices, it's down to 5 grams per kilogram, which is almost unsustainable unless you pour an enormous amount of fertilizer onto the soil. So how do you actually measure the carbon content? How do you establish, for example, whether Alan Savory's methods are better than any other method?
Yeah, at the moment, it would be lovely if we had a satellite measuring system, that could look down on soils and tell you, but unfortunately we don't. And at the moment, you still really have to go through rather time-consuming sampling processes, to actually sample the soil itself. But it's not that difficult. It's just that it costs a bit of money and you have to go through the process in a fairly traditional way, just digging down into soil and processing it and seeing what's in it. But I think just on the point you mentioned, Robin, about measuring the carbon, it's also important to look at the microorganisms and the fungi systems in the soil, because they're just as important, if not more important, really, for health of food production and plant growth and biodiversity. So one of the biggest problems in America is the use of pesticides, which have actually effectively killed the microorganisms in the soils at the same time as allowing carbon to diminish. So it's a double whammy, really.
You said that part of the function of the pivot projects was to reduce the chances of future pandemics. Could you say a word about that? How would that be achieved?
Yeah, well, this is working around natural capital issues, as Becky's mentioned, which is there is a very clear understanding that as deforestation has moved forward around the world, it's brought people and communities in closer proximity to biological, ecological systems that are under stress because of cutting forests down. So there's less places for the organisms and the bats and other systems to live. So you get this jumping across of diseases across into humans. And when you look at the graph of the increase in the incidence of these things globally, it's going up quite dramatically in proportion to the rate of increase of deforestation. So basically, what we're doing is bringing knowledge to communities around the world of the relationship between their practices on the ground and increasing risks of these diseases spreading in the future. And in that way, helping people to understand that actually it is possible to even reverse the increase that we've had in the past and move back in another direction. At the same time, it's to do with management of vaccine distribution and other things, which is a complex societal logistics problem. So we're also helping on that side of things too. So it's a rather holistic approach to looking at the different elements of both reducing the disaster risk, but also improving the disaster management practice.
I mean, the problem is that human encroachment into remote areas is a function of human population. I mean, the more people there are on the planet, the further they go to try and find food, shelter, and a source of food or income. So, I mean, without controlling population, it's going to be difficult to stop pandemics occurring in the future, is it not?
Well, in a sense, you could argue that is a driver of the problem, but I would argue myself the bigger driver of the problem is ignorance about the impact that is having on these risks. And there are alternatives. You know, we don't have to cut down forests. We don't have to build roads and exploit forest areas. It's perfectly possible to live happily without doing that. And what we're doing in Pivot projects is demonstrating that very clearly, and with circular economy practices and better use of natural resources. And as Becky's pointed out, valuing natural capital, it is possible to find a better way of living. But I don't disagree that human population increase is a problem.
Could I also ask you one more thing that you alluded to, which was regenerative ocean farming? Could you tell us, just to give you an outline of what that involves and what the potential is?
Yeah, I'm not an expert, I'm afraid, but it's something that emerged out of our analyses. That actually, I mean, one of the most obvious ways of dealing with fish farming, for example, in the oceans, is to reduce the amount of it that we do and increase the amount of sustainable, resilient fish farming, either on land or adjacent to the oceans, and that systems like aquaponics, which are more self-sustaining for harvesting fish, are likely to be the way to go. So in some of the big work I've done at the UN and when we were developing the Sustainable Development Goals, when we analysed this, we found that actually the amount of fish that is ocean farmed that people eat around the world is going down quite dramatically. And in fact, in Japan and China, it's I think it's only about 30 or 40% now of fish comes from the sea. And so it seems perfectly possible to move to a different way of farming fish in the oceans by using practices like aquaponics at a much bigger scale.
The thing I was wondering if you might have been alluding to was growing seaweed as a energy source. So, I mean, biofuels have sort of fallen slightly out of favor because they use up large amounts of land, which you then can't use for growing food, and therefore the price of food goes up. But the proposal is that you grow seaweed and harvest it from the oceans and then use that as a biofuel. Is that something that you're looking at?
Yeah, even in 2010, when I started my charity, I went to New Zealand and I said to them, you know, you should be actually not for biofuels, but for fertilizers, that you'd be much better harvesting your seaweed around the New Zealand coast and using it for fertilizer than digging up phosphates out of the mines in Morocco and transporting them from Morocco to New Zealand and spraying them from helicopters, which is basically how sheep farming is done in New Zealand. And it's taken all that time since then. They're now doing it. So actually, there is now a lot of focus on seaweeds in New Zealand for sustainable agriculture and other purposes. So yeah, I think it's a very important factor, Robin, particularly for countries which have significant coastlines like the UK. I think harvesting of seaweeds could be very significant for nutrients and for fuels. And I think we need a lot more focus on it. There is a lot of research going on in the UK on that now, and I think it's a good thing.
Peter, that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. So we're going to move on now to our third speaker, Sean Spears, who for, I think, 10 or 11 years was ran the Council for the Protection of Rural England, CPRE, and is now Executive Director of the Green Alliance. So Sean's going to talk about prospects for COP26. So Sean, over to you.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, so I'm going to sort of pan out and give a bit of the big picture after the two very expert talks we've had, and I'm going to say a little bit about the tie-in between COP26 and the biodiversity COP15 in Kunming, which is often the poor relation of the climate COP, a bit about the issue of environmental justice, and also about the importance of seeing this not as a sort of year of action, but as the start of a decade of action as we try and turn around climate change and the decline of nature. But I want to start by giving a rather domestic perspective, because Green Alliance is predominantly a domestic charity, deals with domestic policy, and talk about how COP26 can be a kind of catalyst for climate action in the UK. We've got the Climate Change Act. We've got an ambitious nationally determined contribution for Glasgow. We've got an ambitious sixth carbon budget, including now international aviation and shipping. And we now need to deliver these things. And I think it's worth saying that the targets the UK government has set genuinely are world leading. I know they might not be enough. I know that climate change is gathering pace. I know that the UK has a historic responsibility as a rich nation, start of the Industrial Revolution, its history of imperialism, and so on. So no doubt we should do more, and we should do it sooner. But notwithstanding that, I think the targets the government have set are ahead of most of the rest of the world, and are going to be quite hard to achieve. They are ambitious, and they also don't preclude us from going faster. And the history of climate action in the UK, to an extent, is that the more you do, the easier it becomes, though also at the same time, the more stark the problems of climate change become, or more apparent the damage that climate change is doing becomes. So we started with 60% reductions that looked quite ambitious, then went to 80%, and now we've got net zero by 2050. The problem with all this world-leading targetry is that we are off track quite significantly, and we need to do a lot more to achieve the sixth carbon budget, indeed to achieve the fifth carbon budget, and to achieve our nationally determined contribution for Glasgow. And I won't go through the whole details, but Green Alliance produced a net zero policy tracker last month, which is on the website, and which sets out in each of 5 areas how we're falling behind and what more we need to do. But to give the headlines, transport is 31% of UK emissions and hasn't significantly come down since 1990. There has been some tremendous progress in a way. The interest from the Department for Transport in active travel, walking, cycling, etc., is really new. The very fact that we're expecting shortly, we've been expecting it for a little while, often the way with these things, we're expecting shortly a transport decarbonisation plan. I cannot imagine DfT coming out with something called a transport decarbonisation plan 5 years ago. We'll have to see what it does, but the very fact they are addressing this is extremely positive. We've got a commitment to phase out petrol and the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. That seemed quite a stretch target when Green Alliance, WWF, Greenpeace, and a few others were campaigning for it 2 or 3 years ago. We've got that. It's a brave policy, and will, I think, probably, apart from the impact it will have on carbon, help save the UK car industry. But at the same time, we've got a £14 billion programme for new roads, a £27 billion roads programme, 14 billion of it for new roads. Some terrible roads planned. Lower Thames Crossing, Rimrose Valley in Liverpool, going through a really much used local park. Plans all around the country, you can see really damaging road schemes, and DfT will have to address those. On buildings, which is 16%, the Ministry for Homes and Local Government has been missing in action for years on this agenda. it's scrapped the net zero building or the zero carbon buildings program. It really does need to get with the program, and it's got a planning reform due soon. There's been planning white paper out. The origin of that was all about speeding up planning and sweeping away restrictions to development. And subsequently, it's had grafted on it how you can use planning as a means of strengthening nature networks and protecting important sites and so on. But we don't know how it's going to come out. Is it all about speed of development, or is it about harnessing and protecting nature and natural capital? The culture of the MHCLG is definitely about speed of development, and that's what counts. So we'll have to see what happens with there. Resources. This is a sort of Cinderella subject which is relatively neglected. Globally, extracting and processing resources, according to the UN, causes half the world's carbon emissions and 90% of biodiversity loss. Yet we very seldom talk about resources. And Green Alliance has called for a target for a 50% reduction in resource use by 2050. But we need to put this more centrally on the agenda. Energy I'm not going to talk about, but we do need to carry on phasing out fossil fuels clearly and find a route to market for renewables, and particularly offshore wind and solar, but also onshore wind where communities consented. I don't want to have a return to massive planning battles over onshore wind. It's got to be done with communities, not imposed on them, I believe. But then we come to land, 12% of emissions, but a huge potential for carbon removal, as we've shown. And on the area of land, I think the UK again is showing great international leadership, particularly led by Zach Goldsmith, but the Prime Minister is enthused. The UK was behind the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, which is an ambitious document, but it's hard to escape the impression that domestically we are lagging behind, and that we need to do more domestically to have a credible platform for our international advocacy. So what will happen to farming reforms in England and also in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, because agriculture has devolved, is hugely important. Will the Sustainable Farming Initiative, which is the sort of first tier of the environmental land management scheme, genuinely add value? Will it genuinely provide public benefit, or is it a new way of paying farmers to replace the basic payment scheme of the Common Agricultural Policy, paying farmers just to farm? I'm hopeful that it will genuinely be additional, but it's a really complex thing to move from one system to a new system and keep productive and profitable farmers in business while also improving the environment. So we'll have to see how that scheme is developed over the next couple of years, and there are lots of pilots and trials going on. Then you have nature, local nature, the local nature tier 2 of the ELM scheme, and I don't know that much about that. And then there's a plan for landscape scale change, much bigger changes, possibly along the lines of the NEP rewilding scheme. Though it is worth saying that NEP is trying to expand at the moment and is going to struggle to do so because of planning decisions taken by Horsham District Council that are going to build houses on land that NEP need for their rewilding project. So again, planning and nature policies need to be joined up. Also on UK land policies, we really must stop destroying peat. There is a peat strategy, it's too weak. It's really hard to go into a COP, either COP, and start telling the rest of the world not to destroy their rainforests when we are essentially still burning our equivalent of the rainforest. So we need a much tougher line on peat. I think it would be useful to try and revive the natural capital approach. A couple of years ago, the natural capital approach seemed to be gaining traction in government and in DEFRA. Michael Gove was brought into it. Dieter Helm's Natural Capital Committee was still going. That's now gone. Who is championing natural capital in a kind of really practical way in government? The Dasgupta review is great, but it's a massive report and it needs to be translated into policy, and that is a global report as well. And so embedding a natural capital approach in government thinking, I think, is work that still needs to be done. And then lastly, I'd say that we do need to address the issue of changing diets. The government, when it adopted the sixth carbon budget rejected or said it was not bound by the pathways the Climate Change Committee had set out. And ministers seem particularly neuralgic about the idea that we might eat less meat as being kind of nanny state and potentially very unpopular. And we've seen the lie spread in the United States that Joe Biden's trying to ration American families to, is it one beef burger a month or a year or a week? I can't remember. But the CCC's projections on meat consumption were quite conservative and were no more radical than the changes that have happened anyway, naturally, of people beginning to eat less meat. So I look forward to the National Food Strategy coming out and what that says about food consumption. But I don't think that the message of less meat should be threatening to British farmers. I think a less but better frame can support livestock farming in the UK and diet, public health, climate, and so on. But I don't think it should be a taboo subject. So in terms of achieving our NDC and getting on track to net zero, we are off track. It's really hard. It needs much more consistency across government. It needs the laggard departments being brought into line. It needs a considerable amount of focus. But it is, in a way, remarkable how we're talking more about climate now, probably, and nature, than we were a year ago, in spite of the fact that we've had a year of a global health pandemic and all the strains that's shown on government. This hasn't gone away, and there's a real sense that the transition is happening. The government is brought into it, not just the UK government. I'd say that's about the devolves, and around the world, some of the pledges we've had in the Biden summit a week or two ago. There is a sense of real momentum, and that percolates through into business. It would have been great if it had happened 5 or 10 years ago, but I do think it's happening now and is unstoppable. In concrete terms, Green Alliance's report suggests that we need an extra £22.4 billion spending a year to achieve to get on track to net zero, about double what we're spending at the moment, and that will lever in a considerable amount of private finance as well. And each Treasury event, budget and spending programme that the Chancellor has introduced, we've always been told, no, the stuff on climate's coming next time. It's coming next time. But we don't have that much time left. The longer you leave this, the harder it becomes. So we do really need to see where the Treasury is on this. And the fact that they stumped up considerable cash for the Green Homes programme, conceived it poorly, it was more about jobs than carbon, and then scrapped it, is not encouraging. And also in policy terms, the policies announced since the start of 2020 aren't enough to get us on track to meet our nationally determined contribution. They get us about 26% of the way. So we need considerable additional policy changes, and we'll see that hopefully with the transport decarbonisation plan, heat and building strategy, and so on, various policies that are coming. But for the moment, the big message is there's a significant policy and public spending shortfall. And if the UK is going to go into COP26 in Glasgow in November, assuming it takes place, with a really credible platform, not just of saying we've got these commitments and we had the first Climate Change Act, etc., but say we've got these commitments, we're on track, and our national plan for recovery from COVID is absolutely rooted in a green transition. If it's going to be able to do that, it's going to need to change policy quite quickly, and also stop scoring own goals like opening a new coal mine in Cumbria. It's really hard to tell the rest of the world not to open coal mines. I know the coal mines for steel, not for fuel, not for energy, but really you can just imagine what Poland, South Africa, other countries are going to say, China, when we tell them not to open coal mines when we're opening our own. So we need to stop doing silly things as well. Now, I'd say around COP26, most of the media focus, probably most of the NGO focus, certainly most of MPs' focus is on net zero, on mitigation, on how can we get the policies in place to keep global temperature rises as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. But actually what COP is about much more than that. And there is a particularly challenging agenda that doesn't always appeal to those who accept the case for net zero and often see it as a technocratic challenge or one that can benefit the UK economy in terms of the economies of tomorrow rather than the economy of the past. And this is the net zero agenda extraordinarily unites the free market Thatcherite right and the Corbynite left. Everybody is in theory at least committed to net zero, but there's a much harder agenda around debt relief for poorer nations, support for adaptation and resilience, and making up for the loss and damage that Western countries have caused in developing countries through our actions, our greed, one might say. And that is a harder agenda, and I think we need to focus much more on that. I think it's extraordinary, really, that going into the hosting COP26, hosting the G7 presidency, we have cut overseas aid. Absolutely the wrong signal to give. Robin, you've raised a couple of times the issue of population. I'm certainly no expert on population, but I had a lot of people campaigning when I was at CPRE saying CPRE needs to campaign on population, and I've attended a few conferences on it. As far as I can tell, and I think the Dasgupta review says this as well, population is, I agree, an issue, rising global population, but the way to address it is through the alleviation of poverty and through women's empowerment and control over fertility rights and so on. But again, cutting the aid budget ain't going to help with that. So I really, maybe too late, but I would hope that the government would stop throwing bones to the Daily Mail of that sort, because it doesn't really, in terms of the scale of the cost of COVID, it's a drop in the bucket. It was a symbolic and rather cruel and short-sighted act. So I hope that's not too political. So now coming finally, and just going back to this issue of land use and nature, and I think it really has been the poor relation in the past. We're only now really beginning the debate on the true understanding of this twin crisis of climate and nature, and you can't solve one without the other. That was one of the things that Extinction Rebellion sort of put on the map in 2019. Green Alliance and the Climate Coalition had a big lobby of Parliament, I think the biggest ever lobby of Parliament, certainly the biggest on environmental issues. The time is now, which again united those two themes. And there is a new momentum on nature, I think, quite a lot happening, but it's not as deeply rooted as climate policy. The targets aren't as clear. The governmental mechanisms aren't as clear as the Climate Change Committee in its 5-year budget. And actually, I think, and Peter and yourself might disagree, but the science is less clear. It's more complex. It's more difficult to know quite how you restore nature than kind of cut back on parts per million of CO2. So we've got the agricultural reforms in England, some interesting things actually happening in Scotland. I think what we quite often talk about UK when we mean England, because environment and agriculture has devolved, and it's useful to look at some of the things that are happening in the other home nations. We've got the tree and peat strategy. I think the tree strategy is good. The peat strategy needs to be improved. The Environment Bill is about to appear in its third Queen's speech. It was the lodestar of the government's legislative programme in 2019. It was in the last Queen's speech. There's been plenty of legislation since the Environment Bill, which is a big bill, I admit, keeps being pushed back. And we really do need to get that Environment Bill passed. It's got some really important elements in it. We will have a target setting framework. We will have a new aspect of planning policy, which is already introduced, about net gain from new developments. The work of the wonderfully named Sophus Zoo Gasson at the University of Kent is analysing planning that's happened and what net gain is coming about from local developments. I think the paraphrase is that more land is being lost than one might expect, but there is a net gain in biodiversity. So that's got good and bad aspects from my point of view. I think we need to introduce a policy of net gain for major infrastructure as well. Net gain at the moment is only for local developments. We need to see how the local nature recovery networks are set up and whether they're real. There are some tremendous on-the-ground initiatives, the sort Peter's talked about, and I think the fact that the National Farmers Union is committed to net zero is really positive, though one could have lots of arguments about how they're going to achieve it. As I say, the National Food Strategy, which is due, I think, in July, will be really, really interesting in terms of what it says about both improving diets and public health, but also about how you can have productive agriculture that benefits nature. And then we need to join everything else up, the roads, the planning, the trade policy. Is our trade policy really to flog more beef to America? How's that going to help with climate change? There's a huge debate to be had around offsetting. Down tomorrow, there's large sums of money being flashed at conservation charities to plant trees or restore peat on the grounds that this will get big companies off the hook for reducing their emissions. We do definitely need carbon removal, but that can't. We need to be concerned about what Lancaster University calls mitigation deterrence, that you don't mitigate as fast because you think you can offset and capture carbon or remove carbon sometime in the future. So we need, I think, twin targets for those. And we need to avoid, as Becky said, sort of trade-off between nature and carbon, that we just view carbon as the one thing and produce viscous fruit or whatever it is, to capture carbon. But I want to just finish on an optimistic note. I think there is momentum behind all this. I think there's genuine political commitment from most levels of government and certainly from the Prime Minister. I think if we set too unrealistic hopes around Glasgow, then you risk a kind of post-Copenhagen style hangover where it all seems hopeless, and we don't have the luxury of that. We need to keep the momentum for the whole decade. So it's not going to be easy, but I think COP26 can help provide greater momentum, and that we as civil society need to really be supportive of an ambitious COP and not sort of kind of give up on it too soon, but also not set hugely unrealistic ambitions. So that's my two pennyworth, Robin.
Sean, thank you for broadening out the debate. There's a huge number of points to pick up on in that presentation. Could I just pick you up first on a point of detail? Your net zero policy tracker, you said transport's 31%. You're talking about CO2 or greenhouse gases in general?
Well, that's points of detail are always my favourite. I will. It's emissions. It's carbon emissions.
Okay, so you said
greenhouse gases. I take that to be
transport 31, buildings 16, land 12. So that's 59, and then resources. How much were resources?
I think resources. Let me find it. So waste is 6%, and industry, which is 27%. And one of the problems with doing this is there's a kind of what is resources. There's different ways of calculating it.
Yeah, well, that's right. So that still only gets us to 82%. So where does the rest come from? Food.
Power, 11%.
Power, 11%. Okay, right. Okay.
Have I got it all there? Yeah. It's very faint, I'm afraid.
The power has really gone down hugely then. I mean, I think the biggest improvement in decarbonising the British economy has come in the energy sector and not much movement in all the other sectors like manufacturing, building, agriculture. Is that right?
I think so. And that's the danger. It's come in the areas that people don't see. You don't kind of know where your energy's, you turn the lights on, you don't know where your energy's coming from. So there's a tendency now to say that we've done the easy stuff. I say when you sort of hear ministers who are involved in it talking about it, it didn't seem the easy stuff at the time, but it didn't affect individual consumers. It was politically difficult, perhaps difficult with the Treasury, but it wasn't. It was not the same as telling somebody they've got to rip out their gas boiler, which is the really difficult thing we're going to have to face sometime.
Well, the other thing is that, I mean, I think Johnson produced a 10-point plan last autumn for the environment, and it included a big push on hydrogen, which he wanted to use for domestic heating. And my understanding is that that's a rather risky development because we don't yet know whether hydrogen can be used for domestic heating without having to replace all the existing pipework, because hydrogen is a very small molecule, so it leaks very easily. And if it leaks, you're going to get an explosion, and then no one's going to want to use it. So most people thought he should have been talking about heat pumps for domestic heating, and he should have been talking about hydrogen for transport. Is that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think heat pumps, and again, if I can plug Green Alliance's blog, there's a very good blog on Green Alliance's website about heat pumps, but it's not easy, because you also, to make heat pumps effective, you need to do serious retrofitting of leaky old houses and make them energy efficient. So when the government's Green Homes scheme came in, I looked into the possibility of getting a heat pump, but we'd have had to do so much work on the house to make the heat pump effective. It would have been massively expensive. So there are, some difficult decisions ahead for government and householders. But this could also create a tremendous number of jobs as well. And kind of, do we wait as a country and then import a whole lot of heat pumps, or do we try and kind of embrace the future and get one?
There's no doubt that heat pumps are best for new build. I mean, they work really well, particularly if you've got a low temperature system. So if you want to use heat pumps for sort of a low temperature system, like underfloor heating or radiators, you've got to have larger radiators if you're going to have a lower temperature. So in that situation, it works extremely well. Does not work so well if you're retrofitting and you've got small radiators, because then you've got to somehow increase the temperature of the water. So you have to have a method of scaling up the temperature of the system.
That's right. I mean, it's criminal that we're still building houses now that will need to be retrofitted in a few years' time as well, because we got the zero carbon home standard. But we are playing catch up now, at least.
So can we talk about the Green Home Grants Initiative? Because this was brought in with great fanfare. I mean, they said 2 billion of funding was available to people to either fit heat pumps or insulate their properties. But then they gave the administration to a US company based in Virginia, who didn't have a clue what they were doing. And the result was that well-informed people who wanted to get the go-ahead to install the scheme and claim their funds couldn't get permission out of this company. And the deadline for completion, not of the application, but the completion of works, was March the 31st, 2021. So nobody was getting their schemes through in time. Then what happened was that people said, this is ridiculous. There's no way people are going to complete their schemes by March the 31st. And then they decided to extend it by a year, but they didn't roll the money over. So only 8% of the money ever got spent. And then they scrapped it. So it was almost like it was set up to fail. I mean, I wondered whether it was a deliberate attempt to sort of persuade people that green schemes don't work. But that may be just my very cynical approach to an appalling scheme. I mean, the administration was just unforgivable. But anyway, what do you think about that?
Well, I think you're perhaps a little cynical, but I just reaching my bookshelf for this wonderful book, The Blunders of Our Governments. And I think when Volume 2 comes out, the Green Homes Grant is going to have a prominent chapter of its own. So yes, it was. You need long-term schemes. You need actually to skill up a workforce. You need to encourage people all down the supply chain to think there's a future in this, so that they invest. And none of that happened with the Green Homes Grant. It was probably overambitious. And I think to devolve some of this to local authorities, which is the way that's going forward, provided the local authorities are properly funded and skilled to do it, is going to be a better way of doing it.
Because originally they had the green scheme, didn't they? I mean, they had the scheme that was scrapped by Cameron back into the green. There was a green homes initiative then, and what happened was it got scrapped on the grounds that the Big Six said no one was interested in insulating their homes. And what happened then was all the insulating companies went out of business because they got rid of the scheme. And of course, what actually happened was the Big Six were put in charge of administering it. And they had no interest in it working because their job is to sell energy. Their job is not to persuade people to insulate their homes. So Greg Clark, who was the minister in charge, said it was a fundamental error to have given this responsibility to the big six, because their motivation was not to get people to insulate their homes. But of course, then there were no experts around anymore in insulation. So when they introduced the Green Home Grants Initiative, there were very few firms that were capable of doing it. And as far as heat pumps are concerned, I mean, the year before the scheme came in, only 30,000 heat pumps were fitted in the whole of the UK.
Yeah.
So that's the capacity and they've got to be micro certified. They've got to be MCS certified. So you can't just set up a heat pump company and start doing it. You've actually got to know what you're doing, and you've got to get certified. Otherwise, you don't get the renewable heater incentive. So you have to be MCS certified for that. So the whole thing was just so badly planned.
We've had a history of stop-start on this, and you need a long-term consistent policy. We need a strategy. That's why we need more than the 10-point, Prime Minister's 10-point plan was a great speech and a great sort of setting out of a direction of travel. But you need, as the CCC keeps saying, a proper, costed, long-term strategy to achieve all these things. But the demand is there. When they scrapped the Green Homes Grant, they said it was for lack of demand. That's untrue, as the Environmental Audit Committee has shown. There is definitely demand there. And what we know from when they scrapped the previous Green Deal was that there were concerns about whether it was providing value for money, and you might not get as much emissions reductions you want through these schemes. You've got to kind of test them to get them right. But if you don't have any sort of scheme, you're not getting any emissions reduction. And that's one of the sort of lessons of the kind of lost 5 or 6 years after the scrapping of the Green Home Scheme.
Yeah, but even the money that was put up for the Green Home Grants Initiative was disingenuous, because if you got a grant of 5,000 to install the heat pump, you then got a commensurate reduction in the amount of renewable heat incentive that you got paid back subsequently. Yeah. So they were giving with one hand and taking back with the other. So it wasn't as generous as it looked.
No.
Peter, do you have any sort of insights into this area?
Gosh, that's a very it's a very big subject and a very generic question. No, I enjoyed your presentation very much, Sean, and found myself agreeing with a lot of what you said. I've been involved in the initiative at Swansea University called Specific, which has been aiming to look at how you turn buildings into power stations, not just treat them as users of energy, but generators of energy which can deliver surplus back to other people. And the technologies that have been developed there are very interesting, because actually some of them are to do with gathering heat from the surface of the building and gathering solar energy from the surface of the building and processing it in smart ways, which mean you don't need as much insulation. For example, they have a tin shed in South Wales, which is not insulated and used to be owned by the Welding Institute, I think, and is used for lots of manufacturing and other things. And that actually gathers, even in the winter, gathers energy from the surface of the walls of the building and passes it through a heat exchanger and stores the energy in water, in warm water, and that's used in the winter to keep the building warm. And they also, of course, have solar panels for electricity and some battery storage for that. So it seems that even poorly insulated buildings can be made to work with these new technologies, which are not very expensive. But of course, as you pointed out, they do mean you have to rip out some of the old stuff and put in some new. But they do seem to be quite good over time. And they've already shown with new buildings, as you said, Sean, that this is all totally possible and affordable, and we shouldn't be doing anything else. But I think the retrofitting needs a lot of work. But I'm reasonably confident with these technologies we're going to come up with a privately financed approach, because at the end of the day, the way to make all these changes happen is to make them viable as private financed initiatives. And I think rather than at the local authority level, this should happen at the neighbourhood level, where neighbourhood funds, local pension funds and other things are used for the purposes of retrofit and transformation, where everybody wins. And I think the technologies are getting to the point now, solar's cheap enough, and these other technologies are coming along where this is going to be viable. And I think I would rather see us moving down that route. There's trillions of dollars of private equity capital looking for these types of opportunities. And I think if we can connect them up, then I think we could drive change quicker that way.
But the government still has to set the framework. I mean, for example, there's lots of local communities would like to build a relatively small solar farm or a wind farm maybe, and then provide energy for the local community. But at the moment, they're prevented from doing so because there are all sorts of hurdles that you have to overcome if you want to supply electricity. So, for example, you have to have £1 million in your bank account. Well, that immediately excludes any neighbourhood project. You've got to fill in a form of about 1,000 pages where you describe exactly how you balance your supply against fluctuations in the national grid. And of course, that's relevant if you're a big supplier of energy. It's not really relevant if you're a small supplier. So the local electricity bill is a private member's bill that's working its way through Parliament at the moment. Its architect is Steve Shaw from Power for People. And they're trying to remove these obstacles that prevent people providing small amounts of energy locally. But of course, unless the government adopts the local electricity bill, it ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
But I think Peter's right that we kind of know how to do it, and in time, money will flood in. And I think some of the innovations, including kind of small scale ones, are really exciting, and you kind of scratch your head about how to get them mainstream. But it is partly about the public policy framework. Internationally, the Ashton Awards every year have tremendously exciting schemes. You think, why aren't they taking off? 10 years ago, I went to Freiburg in Germany and saw a kind of farmer who turned his small dairy farmer turned their milking parlour into a CHP unit and was selling energy back to the grid. You think this is doable, and it makes people money.
Yeah, we see the big suppliers don't like it because their business model is to build a massive power station and then distribute via a network to all the households in the country. And that's the model that, for example, they still try and pursue in places like India. And of course, the national grid keeps going down because they can't cope with the demand. So in India, it would be much more sensible if villages had PV panels and batteries and set up an interconnected network, and they wouldn't have to rely on the national grid at all. But of course, the central authorities in these countries don't like a model where communities have their own energy supply. They like to be able to control it from the centre. So we've got to get away from this massive centrally provided energy supply into lots of small schemes at the periphery, which are much more efficient and far more reliable than what goes on at the present time in developing nations.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with you about India because I'm chair of a program called Sunrise, which is taking the Swansea technologies into villages in India. And Narendra Modi is very supportive of it. And in fact, the Tata Group are working with Rockefeller Foundation to roll out 10,000 microgrids in villages in India. So actually, I think, Robin, it is happening now. And we're involved in a couple of villages to demonstrate how good it is for the local communities. So I think it is beginning to happen. Similar things are happening in Mexico as well.
Well, not before time, because the Indian government is still building coal-fired power stations instead of erecting solar farms everywhere.
Yeah, indeed. But hopefully they won't need to build as many now.
Yes. And also, the Jeremy Leggett had a scheme, Solar Century, where he did the same thing in Africa. Yeah. So you simply have a PV panel on the top of a pole and a battery, and then individual households can run their LED lighting, their computers, and charge their mobile phones off the battery. So they're completely independent. And it's better than burning kerosene, which is what they currently do for lighting. And I think he was awarded the Gothenburg Prize for bringing that technology to 10 million people in Africa. But of course, it was very patchy. I mean, I think he was very successful places like Kenya, which have a sort of proactive attitude to green initiatives, whereas other countries have not benefited from that and are still burning kerosene. So again, it's the government that has to be receptive to the ideas for it to be introduced on a large scale.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have a look at the, yes, we've got a few questions on the chat function. So Peter, this is really for you. How quickly can agriculture become effectively net zero once governments commit?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably not so much governments commit as farmers commit, really. The speed is going to be very dependent on the willingness of farmers to change and to access investment to enable that change to happen. So I think, we need to set up the business models for investment in that, the no-till agriculture, for example. Farmers have got to actually buy new equipment, the drilling machines and so on, which are quite expensive. So it probably depends a little bit on the replacement cycle for machinery on farms. Obviously they'll be replacing their machinery, so they may want to wait until the next cycle. So it's hard to see the speed being more than a transformation, say, within 10 years. But I think 10 years is probably a realistic target for change. Once we get all these different incentives and funding schemes set up, and particularly the private sector funded schemes set up, I think it can happen very quickly, because it's one of these things where we know from examples in the UK that farmers find it tremendously exciting when they make the change happen. They find it very, very rewarding in all sorts of ways. The biodiversity coming back, the productivity increasing, the link to local people buying local food, and all those things start happening, and it's a very rewarding thing to do. So I think once we get to a sort of a process where all these things are in alignment, I think it could happen very quickly, because it's actually a win-win-win type outcome.
So at the moment, there's all sorts of problems going on with the farmers in India. I mean, apart from, until the sort of pandemic took off. But I mean, there were protests because the government wanted to remove the guaranteed price for food. And the alternative was that the small farmers had to sell their produce to large corporations.
Yeah.
So the danger was that they would then dictate to the farmer exactly how they had to rotate their crops and what pesticides they had to use at certain times of year before they would buy their produce. So that's what the sort of protests, I think, were about. So how would you advise the sort of way forward in somewhere like India, where you've got that tension between small sustainable farmers and agribusiness coming in with their sort of pesticides?
Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because India is obviously going through what we went through quite a number of years ago now, and trying to increase productivity, basically. The government's looking at productivity compared with other countries and are saying, this is not good enough because their population's growing and we're going to have trouble feeding it. And India's importing more and more food, so the government's saying, well, what do we do? And the only thing the governments can do is this sort of big sledgehammer approach to try and get big business involved, which personally I don't think is the right answer. I think the right answer would be to work with local farmers and to actually move forward with the approaches that I've been talking about, and actually lift productivity that way in a much more decentralized, localized way, which will be more resilient and sustainable in the future. But unfortunately, that message is not being heard, because it's obviously not something the government can easily do. It's something that local farmers have to do, and I think it becomes a bit political then as to how that's resolved. So I think it's very difficult. But in pivot projects, we are working with local communities in countries like India and African countries, and Nepal and other places, to actually bring forward regenerative agriculture and actually really show that it can be done locally, and productivity can go up, and you can supply food locally with a resilient system. So I don't know the answer, but we're working really hard to try and create a bottom-up revolution rather than the top-down one.
Thank you, Peter. Sean.
Yes, Greg, I'd like to ask Peter, both domestically and internationally, do we kind of know how to do this? Know how to get to zero carbon agriculture in a way that doesn't make unrealistic assumptions of everybody becoming a vegan or whatever? Is the science there, and does it match the political reality?
Yeah, that's a very good question in relation to particularly to beef and other aspects, which obviously are difficult. But I think in principle we do. But it requires offsetting, really. And of course, as you pointed out, Sean, that's a pretty uncomfortable situation, because it's not necessarily tackling the big problems. It's actually sort of using offsets to actually avoid getting to the root of the problem, and that's a worry. So I think net zero agriculture using offsetting can be realistically done, but does it actually get to the root of the problem? Probably not. What we need is zero carbon or zero emissions agriculture, and that's much more challenging. And I think that will require us to eat a lot less meat. I don't have any doubt about that. And that's going to be tough. But I think in the end, that's where we're going to end up.
I mean, talking of discouraging meat, I mean, as Sean said, the sort of government in the UK seems neuralgic about telling people what they can and can't eat. But I mean, I have said to my American friends who eat hamburgers, I said, you do realize that processed meat has been classified by the International Agency for Research into Cancer as a grade 1 carcinogen. So eating hamburgers from a carcinogenic point of view is like smoking. They didn't believe me, but I mean that is the situation. I think that is the way to get people to stop eating processed meat. Certainly, as far as other types of meat, organic meat is concerned, I mean it depends how it's raised. If you raise it using traditional methods, then that's one thing. But if you're doing it through industrial farming and you're keeping cattle indoors and feeding them grain which is produced with nitrogen fertilizers, and you're adding to the greenhouse gases nitrous oxide, then that's a different thing altogether. So I don't think you can get food production to net zero. I think it's impossible, because food is part of the natural carbon cycle. I mean, it's part of the biological carbon cycle. The stuff that's doing the damage is the fossil fuel carbon, the stuff we're digging out the ground. So I think there might be a sort of slight wishful thinking that you can get agriculture down to net zero, because as long as there's 7.7 billion humans on the planet, I don't think it's possible. Either of you can answer that little diatribe.
I was thinking that's probably not for Peter.
Yeah, well, I think the methane issue is the big problem.
Yes,
but I think if you take Alan Savory's approach, which shows that actually if you graze land sensibly, that animals are quite important for sequestering carbon in grassland. So actually there is a methodology with grazing sensibly, which Alan Savory's pretty much worked out, where actually you can get to a net zero carbon outcome with animals grazing grassland. So I'm not sure you're right, Robin.
It requires very intensive bits of grazing, doesn't it? I mean, they put...
No, it's not intensive. No, it's not intensive. That's the whole point. It's not intensive. It's managed. Okay. But it's relatively lightly grazed. So if the world ate enough meat that allows that type of farming practice to proceed, then I think it is possible. But it is a very large reduction in meat consumption from what we have now. but we don't have to get rid of meat altogether.
Well, look, that's really been fascinating, and I'd like to thank both of you for contributing to that discussion. So it's sort of time for a short break. So we resume at 11:30. So 15 minutes to make yourself a cup of coffee. And thanks to both our speakers once again. Bye-bye now.
Good morning and welcome to our second session for Me C4 event. Though this session is about land use, so that's a particular interest of mine. I'm very much looking forward to hearing our three speakers today. How do we use the land? You know, this is quite critical. You know, how do we use, and the word using for me is already a question mark. Do we use the land? Are we entitled to use the land? You know, this is a perspective I'd really love to explore. So I'm going to be welcoming today Sue Roberts, followed by Penelope Tollett, and then Hugo Spowers, who will be talking about different aspects of how we may be relating to the land and maybe their way, maybe I'm looking forward to hearing whether they have solutions or suggestions that they can make for us. So let's start with Sue. Sue, you can talk about your own company. Every profile has been publicized. I'm not going to go into details. It's not really my style. I think it's best that you talk for yourself if you want to say anything. But I'm really looking forward to hearing about housing and planning. So how do we optimize land use? You know, when we're planning for new houses, do we need new houses even, Sue? Go ahead.
The smoke had wafted out of the church and the bodies lay piled up the aisle and dotted over the pews. The men came in with their shovels, jostling for position, and set to work, filling up their wheelbarrows. They wheeled out barrowload after barrowload of small, furry, dead bats. The clusters of bats and their inevitable droppings have been a nuisance for years. Nature, incompatible with humankind, and they had been smoked to death in their hundreds. That was clearly a while ago. The story was told me a couple of years ago when I was on a bat walk. A whole section of the normal route had fallen empty. We had not heard a single bat. Now, there's my screen. Such has been the change in the bioabundance of animals. In the early 1980s, I studied wild rabbits for my Oxford University doctorate. I chose rabbits because they were plentiful and easy to watch. Not so now. Now they are on the red list for endangered species. The size of the catastrophic decline in nature depends on your starting point. This watch list indicator shows an 80% drop in the size of key species populations in the UK from 1970 to 2010. But go back to an earlier starting point and the decline would be far, far greater. Why does this even matter? What has nature ever done for us? What has it done, aside from providing clean air, clean water, flood control, the breaking down of waste, local climate control, shade, and tranquility of mind? Well, there is food, there are the pollinators. We are so close to losing our insects. Without pollinators, there would be no fruit and very few vegetables. We would have the grains, there would be bread. But man cannot live by bread alone. Losing the insects, a vital element of our ecosystem, would be like taking out the crucial supporting block of a Jenga tower. The whole edifice would collapse, which would be fatal to us. We must work fast and furiously to recover nature. But by how much? The UK government talks about leaving nature in a better state or ensuring that development causes no net loss or perhaps a 10% gain. But against which depleted baseline? Against industrialized farmland with zero biodiversity? Such a gain would be zero. The goal should not be relative to the current state of nature. It should be an absolute. Bioabundance Community Interest Company, which I chair, has set a goal for us to restore nature to its best state since 1950. What we need to be sure of are viable populations of plant and animal life. We chose 1950 because that was when we started to pour chemicals onto our land. Meanwhile, there is a destructive rush to build upon our land for financial gain. Once land has been concreted over, it cannot be restored for nature or used for regenerative farming. Each new town or road bisects a landscape across which previously animals and plants could flow. Creatures are forced into smaller and smaller islands. As the islands become too small, inbreeding and disease quickly extinguish populations. In South Oxfordshire, where I live, there is a plan to build 32,000 homes, that's all this, between 2011 and 2035. That is a 50% increase in houses over what we had. And yet, over this period, the Office for National Statistics projects that a mere 8,000 new households will form. So, 4 dwellings are to be built for each one that can become a home. And necessarily, 24,000 newly empty homes will be created. It need not be the new homes that lie empty. It might be the Oxford mansions and the chocolate box Chiltern villages that empty out. They are bought up by the global wealthy as second, third, fourth homes, or left empty as money boxes. This overdevelopment plan was forced through the newly elected Green Lib Dem Council in South Oxfordshire, against its will, by Robert Jenrick, the Conservative Government Minister for Housing. The plan had been created by a previous Conservative council. Bioabundance Community Interest Company challenged the adoption process in the planning courts on Thursday, 2 days ago. But our case was thrown out. Crucially, development plans are supposed to mitigate climate change, but planners and government's idea of what mitigation means is different from the IPCC definition. Mitigation of climate change should mean reducing greenhouse gases. Government takes it to mean increasing greenhouse gases through development, but by not so much as you would otherwise have done. So they're really mitigating greenhouse gases rather than mitigating climate change. This final recourse in the courts, which we were pursuing, will not be open to citizens in the future, as the government intends to end the right to judicial review. All this is not to minimise the acute housing affordability crisis. This is caused by low interest rates, low salaries and benefits, and other unfortunate macroeconomic factors. The simplistic supply-demand model does not apply. House prices do not come down with more houses built. This huge development of flats at Battersea Power Station was under construction down the road from where my son lived, in a vermin-infested damp basement shared with other professionals. I suggested he look at buying a studio flat there, but the prices started at an eye-watering £1.3 million. Even if on another planet where he could have afforded this, he would not have got a look in. The first tranche of 1,500 flats were sold overnight via Singapore. They were not even advertised in England. Our housing crisis is one of affordability, not of supply. There is more housing per person in this country than there has ever been. The financialisation of housing is the problem here. 80% of lending in the UK is for housing, and our casino capitalism depends on this single asset class. Remarkably, and this I get from Mariana Mazzucato, the economist, in national accounting, owner-occupiers are deemed to be paying rent to themselves, And this imaginary financial transaction is added to GDP. So as house prices rise, so does our deemed rent, which bolsters up GDP. House prices could be stabilised by restricting the buying of homes to those who live in the area, as in New Zealand and India. Or homes could be sold only for residential purposes, as in St Ives, Cornwall, reducing the second home ownership problem that prices locals out of their right to shelter. At this point, I'm usually asked 3 questions. Why would developers build homes they cannot sell? There is an insatiable, almost infinite international market for homes, unrelated to local need. Developers can sell homes even if they are to remain empty. The second question is, if this is too many homes, they will not be built. So what is the problem? And here I must let you into a secret and describe to you a very little understood aspect of current planning law in the UK. Local councils set a target number of homes that must be built. In South Oxfordshire, it is an average of 1,000 a year. The 5-year housing land supply rule says that if it cannot be proved that 5 years' worth of houses are in train to be built, if there are not spades in the ground for 5,000 houses in South Oxfordshire, then the council has failed the test. The phrase land supply has been snuck in to this rule so that people wrongly believe that the failure is due to insufficient land having been allocated to housing. It is not. In our case in South Oxfordshire, land has been allocated for over 32,000 homes, so it has a 40% buffer relative to the target that the district is required to meet. But if developers fail to build, they themselves can then insist on being allocated more land. It is then that speculative land grabs succeed, a win-win for developers, a lose-lose for us, the citizens, and for the climate. The third question is, won't the homes be filled with people coming from London? It must be understood that all parts of our country are being told to build houses far in excess of need. Government wants 300,000 new houses every year, but only half that number of households are likely to form. Necessarily, for every 2 new dwellings built in England, 1 new empty home is created. So yes, people might come from London to South Oxfordshire, but then who will fill the emptying out homes there? It's not only nature that suffers from unneeded development, it is also the climate. 100 tonnes of CO2 are released just during the construction of the average home, with its share of supporting facilities. As developers have prevented zero carbon homes from being mandated, as they were supposed to have been in 2016, we still have homes being built that will ooze out 5 tonnes of carbon dioxide per annum for their whole lives. These add to the 27 million homes that need eco-fitting to reduce carbon emissions. There is no plan for how this will be done. We should be building the number of homes we need, not the number of homes the market can absorb. We should always plan first for nature, which is fragile and essential. Professor Lawton's 2010 government report, Making Space for Nature, makes it clear that before anything, we must plan for the restoration of nature at a landscape scale. The focus in Britain now is on protecting nature through natural capital accounting, most notably brought forward in the review of Professor Dasgupta. Monetising the value of nature in terms of natural capital and ecosystem services is good and bad. Does it make us protect nature or exploit its value for financial gain? As I see it, there are 3 ways that natural capital attracts finance, or investment, as it is known. 1 is direct investment in nature to protect the interests of the investor, where nature is providing clear services. For example, Insurance companies might invest in wetlands to reduce flooding. I don't know that they do. The second is offsetting, and this is by far the biggest, sacrificing areas for development and making up for the nature losses with a payout by developers for the enhancement or protection of existing natural areas. And the third would be direct exploitation, managing land to produce goods such as food and wood, or for tourism and entertainment. The architecture for managing natural capital and offsetting is to be through local nature partnerships. We are setting one up in Oxfordshire. It will be dominated by business and development interests, with only 1 or 2 seats on the board for nature groups. It will join with other partnerships along the so-called Oxford-Cambridge arc to manage the industrialisation of this rural area. Money for nature and carbon sequestration will flow from the building of 1 million unneeded houses. And that is the only place that the money will come from. But let us not kid ourselves, nature cannot be moved. The best way to restore it is not to trash it in the first place. But financial valuation as natural capital would not protect it. If you just look at the balance, nature's value across the Oxcam arc is £3 billion. That is a drop in the ocean compared with the profits from 1 million homes, which would be, say, 200 billion if each sold for £200,000. How far will government step in to see that natural capital does not lead to asset stripping of our countryside? We will still have the tension between public good and the juggernaut of capitalist dogma, blind to anything but the principle of maximising profit and smug in its assumption that the invisible hand of the market will magically make everything right. The house-building finance complex, as Bob Colnut calls it, is a global problem. And the financialisation of our natural world is a two-edged sword. I'm just going to share my slides again. Cambridge is well ahead of Oxfordshire. The direct exploitation of nature is already underway. Investors have rushed in to convert water meadows where cows once grazed into a new municipal park with plastic cows. Financiers are particularly keen on nature areas maintained by volunteers, which will be more profitable. So how can we promote nature and regenerative farming and stop unneeded urbanisation? Protecting, extending and enriching existing natural landscapes is one way. Bioabundance is proposing a new national park northeast of Oxford, incorporating Otmoor and the ancient forests of Burnwood and Stowood. Now that government has scrapped the idea of an unneeded motorway between Oxford and Cambridge, the park could be extended northwards to the Upper Ray wetlands and the Brill Hills. Oxford City Council is in favour of considering such a park. Bioabundance is an extensive group of ecologists, planners, lawyers, and enthusiasts for nature. We would welcome you at www.bioabundance.org.uk. Many thanks.
Thank you, Sue. That was so interesting. Just the idea of money boxes I find quite distressing, to be quite honest. And I've just been spending quite a lot of time on the Isle of Wight, and I've seen lots of rabbits, and I see these houses being snapped, any house that go for sale just go within a week, literally. So it is really reflecting, the trends that you indicate. I also ask myself, why do we not let nature do its thing? Why do we have to interfere? Why do we have to control so much? So thank you, Sue, for that. I want to invite you guys people who are viewing this to use the YouTube chat box and put questions in it. So we'll have time after Penelope and Hugo speak. We'll have half an hour where we can have questions and answers. So please do put your questions. If you're inspired by Sue and you have questions for her, please put them in the YouTube chat box. So I'm going to move straight to Penelope. Penelope, you've been into planning, so I guess that's directly related as well to housing development, and so I guess again that's more the kind of the technical side or formal side. I mean, I hear that the government's not really doing what needs to be doing based on what Sue was telling me. So do you have more insights? What can you tell us about these things? Go ahead.
Okay, so let me be more conventional than Sue and share my screen throughout my presentation. I must admit, following Sue's presentation, you will find mine is much more pedestrian. I am a professional town planner by my job. That's how I earn my living. And what I want to talk today about is the specific issue of cutting carbon. I'm lazy. I don't really mean carbon. I mean greenhouse gases, but I can't be bothered to say greenhouse gases, let alone carbon dioxide. So I'm afraid, like so many people, I just use carbon. I'm glad that Sue's covered biodiversity, because I'm specifically not covering that because there's too much to do. So the problems in the planning system are many, and I will take you through a few of them. The other thing just to note is that I'm specifically talking about England. I'm out of touch with what's going on in Wales and Scotland because we've had devolved planning for 20 years, I would guess, since the devolved administrations anyway. So strategic planning in theory should be a bit like a flowing river. You can imagine it going over a number of waterfalls. You have the government setting laws and regulations at the top. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. We have then there's national policy that is set, and then there's local policy, and then you determine planning applications. So it should all be very straightforward and orderly. You'll notice on this slide that strategic planning is up in the air. That is deliberate because strategic planning is up in the air. Since 2010, we haven't had effective strategic planning in England, and it was abolished with the Localism Act, and a system called the Duty to Cooperate was introduced, which those of you that follow planning will know and probably hate. So this orderly system is fine so long as it flows. Well, without strategic planning in it, there's a bit of a block. But equally, if at any stage of that flowing, things get sort of caught up in a logjam, then the level below can't deal with it. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. And I'm going to look at this in sort of two ways. The scope of the planning system, because it may surprise you that planning doesn't cover half of the things that most people think planning does cover. And then some of the issues about process. So onto this picture that wanted to show itself earlier. Typical urban environment happens to be High Wycombe, which is where I live and work, but I could have picked any place. So what on this photograph does planning control? Well, most of the buildings that you see on that photograph were built before planning controls came in. They came in mostly after the Second World War, and most of the buildings on that picture were built before then. Not all of them by any means, but most of them. All those little buses and cars and things that you can see, and the train on the far left-hand side, and the dual carriageway in the foreground, all that is controlled by the Highway Authority. The way the roads function, the way bus services operate, they are a function of the highway and transport authorities and not the planning authority. Planning can collect money to facilitate transport relative to a development, but it is not in control of those of the transport system. And all those existing buildings, well, unless they need planning permission for something, they're built. There's nothing, therefore, to do with planning. So planning deals with new development. Which, of course, is a tiny fraction of our existing urban environment. But even within that, over the last 10 years, there's a huge amount of development that can now take place without it needing to go through a full planning process. It's called permitted development. Sometimes you have to get prior approval from a local authority to implement your permitted development, but the government effectively grants class planning permission for certain types of activity. So actually the remit of what we used to think of as planning is increasingly small. And just to make matters even worse, the emissions of carbon dioxide from buildings is actually controlled through the building regulations and not through planning. And there's a long-standing principle, and it does make a lot of sense legally, that one set of regulations can't reach over and deal with something that's dealt with by another set of regulations. So planning has its own set of acts and regulations, and because building regulations deals with emissions, planning can't say, oh, we're going to do that. We're going to take that power onto ourselves, as it were. Of course, the problem there is that if the government then doesn't put into the building regulations carbon emissions targets, then we don't achieve any carbon emissions from our buildings. And Sue's already touched on that. So we could therefore imagine, we might think that planning is a big Russian doll, but we find, in fact, that planning is a small Russian doll. So let's just have a moment looking at the law, because that is obviously the starting point for all of this. Planning only exists as an activity because there are regulations. Let's be clear about it. It's a bit of a strange profession in that way. So there are two things I want to draw your attention to. First of all, in the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004, which is a long time ago now, there was a duty put upon planners when they're making long-term plans to have the objective of contributing to the achievement of sustainable development. Now, being an old greenie, I was delighted when that came out in the 2004 Act, and I thought that was actually going to allow us to do something quite meaningful. But it all comes down to definitions, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. The other critical bit of law is Section 19 of the 2004, again, the 2004 Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act, as amended by Section 182 of the Planning Act 2008, which requires development plan documents, again, those documents that forward plan for an area. Sorry, as somebody pointed out to me, you can't backward plan. The plans that we make for an area should be designed to secure the development and use of land in the local planning authority area, contribute to the mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. Again, woohoo, hooray, we can do something. But we find that we can't, because as you will remember, on that river, we've got the legislation at the top, but then we have national policy. And central to everything that planning now does is the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework. Now, this was first written in 2012, replacing lots and lots of guidance, and no harm in the précis that actually went on, slimming all that guidance down to this single policy framework. But the problem is, if there's then a hole in this framework, everyone suffers from that hole. And this is one of the problems about centralisation. Somebody once said, if you have a model solution, you get a model problem, because everyone it builds that same problem in. Whereas if you had a decentralised system, then some people would do one thing and some people would do something else, and you can actually learn from one another and develop and innovate. So when the first NPPF came out in 2012, again, it all looked quite hopeful because there was a presumption in favour of sustainable development. Well, who couldn't be in favour of a presumption in favour of sustainable development? The problem is this bit about definitions. And the 2012 NPPF defined sustainable development as the NPPF. So you couldn't, as a planner, and I became a chief planner, you couldn't get out of that cycle, because you can't use a different definition of sustainable development because the government has defined it for you. And so therefore, all we could do was form our local plans in the image of the NPPF, which is not a bad thing in that you do need a government structure. But if it's out of the NPPF, then it's out of all plans. And it's only in 2019, that revision of the NPPF, that we actually got something relatively strong in relation to climate change. So paragraph 148 of the most recent NPPF actually talks about planning contributing to the radical reductions of greenhouse gases. But that's only in paragraph 148. It's nothing in any of the strategic paragraphs higher up the document. But it is there. However, most of our local plans that have been written were written following the earlier, sorry, let me just take a step back. Local plans take a long time to make. Don't get me started on that, but they do. Even a good planning authority, following the rules, doing, when I say good, I mean a well-behaved, in government terms, planning authority, doing all the things that's asked of them, it takes years. So plans that are currently being adopted will have been prepared under previous MPPFs. So they won't have taken this paragraph about radical reductions into account. And that actually is quite an issue because those local plans last for a long time. So there's a lag in the system. So what's the problem with the planning system? Well, actually, the planning system feels a bit like this. It isn't a system. It is broken. So, and in addition to that, it actually doesn't cover the things that a lot of people assume that it would cover anyway. Just returning briefly to the building control issue and the ratchet. So I think it must have been 2008, 2009, the government became very clear, the then government became very clear that it wasn't for local plans to put carbon targets or energy targets in local plans. And they proposed a ratchet system that would have brought new homes to being carbon neutral. We would already have had carbon neutral homes for a number of years if that had been continued. And then the 2010 government broke that ratchet. But because of the fact that planning can't then reach over and deal with it, it's just left a massive hole. And the most recent thing that the government is now trying to do to fill that gap is still not talking about having carbon neutral homes. They're talking about achieving 80% reductions so that they would continue to emit even when we're in a world when we need to be in no emissions and have to be adapted subsequently. The other thing to mention, and again comes from the same time, is this abolition of strategic plans, which I've already mentioned, and it being replaced by the duty to cooperate. The consequence of this was that we ended up focusing only on housing numbers. We lost all ability to look at place shaping, because what the duty to cooperate means is that groups of local authorities basically trade housing numbers across borders. It's a bit like monopoly for real, except that the local authority, of course, doesn't get any of the money from the housing because it's a private sector activity. So you end up focusing so much on the numbers rather than, well, this community needs houses here for these people. And so it becomes disconnected. And it also meant that we stopped the growing focus on environment, which really had been building to that point. It was rather depressing. And then in 2015, we had Paris. And again, we all looked hopeful and nothing happened. However, we now do have the 6th carbon budget and the government has accepted the 6th carbon budget. So I wonder if this is another opportunity for us to see if that will give us any purchase on this issue. So what do we do about it? Well, it's a bit corny to say we have to connect up, but it's absolutely true. Hold in your mind that picture of an urban environment or your local place. This isn't a problem for planning. This is a problem for councils. It's not only a problem for councils, it's a problem for all of us. But councils need to look at this in the round. They need to look at their transport issues. They need to look at how they're delivering housing, how they're managing their parks, delivering leisure facilities and all those things. And many, many councils have declared a climate emergency. Now, first thought about climate emergencies is that given that the 6th carbon budget has now come out, perhaps some of those declarations now need to be updated to take into account the new requirements of the 2035 78% target, rather than the previous 60-something% 2030 target. It might not be as much as some councils have gone beyond that and said we should be zero by 2030, but those that haven't, perhaps they can step up a bit further. And that climate emergency declaration then needs to drive all activities within a local council. And the other thing, and you will see that I haven't got copyright to show you this cartoon. So if these slides are shared at all, I will have to remove this picture. But I loved it. Careful, Henderson. Where there's smoke, there's mirrors. So one of the things that's coming down the track is planning reform again. But this is really radical planning reform. And we had a white paper in the autumn of last year. And we are expecting legislation or draft legislation or some indication of future direction in June this year. There are a number of things that we can expect in it. Local plans will not be the way they have been in the past. So in terms of what would a council do, well, frankly, if you're a local council, don't at the moment think about what you do on your local plan. Wait and see what's coming out of the planning reforms. They're planning to centralise all the policies against which planning applications are assessed. And that's, I've already said, I'm not a fan of centralisation, but actually there are a lot of reasons why that is not a bad idea given where planning has got to and the value of the local input in that type of policy. And if the government puts the right things in those policies, then at a stroke, what gets built will deliver to a higher environmental standard. Of course, they may not put the right things in those policies, and we will have to wait and see what comes out. However, the planning white paper, when it was issued in the autumn of last year, it said a few nice things about carbon and climate. It had virtually nothing in it to deal with those issues. But the world has changed quite a lot since then. We're talking about this issue much more. We've had the 6th carbon budget. There have been a number of other things. So I find it difficult to believe that what comes out in the summer will be as empty on this subject as it has been before. And the other thing that the government is now doing is actually it's going back to some strategic planning. So Sue's already mentioned the Oxford to Cambridge arc. The government is preparing a strategic plan for that area. And the draft sort of prospectus that it issued in February, I think it was this year, put environment actually at the centre of it, which was something of a surprise. So it is possible that the government is beginning to realise that actually we can't keep on building without making sure that we are taking care of the planet. Now, I'm not suggesting that it'll be everything that everyone on this call would wish for, but it's certainly a shuffle in the right direction. So what do we do whilst we're waiting for these reforms to come out? Well, we actually just wait for these reforms. And when they come out, we need to make sure that we scrutinise them really carefully. And if they're not doing the right job, we need to get together and campaign to get that changed. But if they don't come out, we also need to campaign for them to come out. On the session before the morning break, one of the speakers talked about the Environment Bill, which is full of good stuff, could be better, but it's full of good stuff, but it keeps being delayed. And delay means that we're not acting. And as everybody knows, it's one thing to have a target, but we actually need to implement things to deal with those targets. Just looking at my final bit of notes, I think I've probably covered most of what I had thought to say. Yes, one last thought. So I've talked mainly about making plans. I haven't talked much about making the decisions on planning applications. They follow from whatever is in your plan. But the 6th carbon budget is new. And I explained how local plans have to take account of the NPPF and it all sort of flows down. It should be like this river. And if it's blocked up at the top, you can't deal with it later down. But the 6th carbon budget wasn't part of that waterfall because it's a new consideration. So it is possible if a council really wanted to, again, make what they can of this issue in order to give it profile and to try to encourage, embarrass the government into doing more, it is possible that they could use that as what is known in the trade as a material consideration in determining a planning application, saying, well, this is, okay, there's a local plan, and if we went through the local plan, we'd say this in response to this planning application, but there's something new, there's something else now in this debate, and we need to take that into account. Now, I'm not saying that's straightforward, and I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not giving you professional planning advice saying go and do this, but I am saying it's worth thinking about whether there are some key cases where that could actually be useful. I've got a few references. I don't know if these slides are going to be shared, but there are a couple of references there in case they are. And with that, I'll say thank you very much.
Thank you, Penelope. Again, I'm always struck. Law, regulation, it's all about definitions. That's what I keep hearing. It's like, can we agree on the same words, so we can act on them? That's really what I keep hearing. And, embarrassing the government to do more. It's like, why do we have to do this? We've voted them in to do things for us. Why are they not doing it for protecting our future, protecting nature, building the houses that we need, And I'm struck with the fact that XR helped, the Parliament declared an emergency, and we got many councils declaring that, a climate emergency following suit. But again, it's, we'll see whether we can have questions around that. What can councils do, without the government if the government's not doing it? And that's really where I'm coming from hearing you, Penelope. So thank you for that. So that was two perspectives on land use. Please put your questions in the YouTube chat box with the Q in front, and we'll come back to your questions once we've heard from Hugo. And Hugo brings a more kind of circular economy perspective, a broader perspective. I always think we need to live on the land, but we also travel on the land. And I believe Hugo is here today to give us that perspective. Like, are there ways for us to be better, in our relationship with the land when we travel? Hugo.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I will just share my screen now. And yes, well, we are a car company, so we may not seem to fit into land use, but we are. I set the company up 20 years ago entirely for environmental reasons, and we're probably the only car company in the world who thinks we've got far too many cars. This is our purpose statement. To pursue systematically the elimination of environmental impact of personal transport. And there are two key words in there. There's the elimination. Reduction is not an adequate goal, because being less unsustainable is still not sustainable. But we're not going to get there overnight. It's an ambitious goal. And so systematically is a terribly important word. We've got to make sure that every investment we make takes us towards that end goal, rather than going after the low-hanging fruit, going after something that's a little bit less damaging, but has no hope of ever being sustainable, because it means that you've reached a dead end, you can't get to where you want to go, and you've got to write off all the investment you've made in getting to the wrong place and start all over again. So we've got to have a backcast strategy to get to a sustainable future. And I think there's something quite wonderful about the clarity of an absolute like that. We need to be honest. There's far too much vacillation in everything we do, and there's no ambiguity in that message. But we are building hydrogen fuel cell vehicles at the moment because we don't believe that anything can be remotely as efficient as a hydrogen vehicle for the sort of range to which we've become accustomed. But it's not batteries or hydrogen. We need them both. And we don't argue about solar PV or wind turbines, which one's going to win the renewable energy race. They're just different, and you need them both, and it's rather a silly question. And the same is true of hydrogen and batteries. There's a few other points I'd like to make initially. We are a highly collaborative company. We want to open source our technology when we come to the volume market, and you don't get much more collaborative than that. But we're often not seen as being collaborative, seen as going it alone, because we don't collaborate for the sake of it. And I think that it's worth observing that people and organizations do get together and coalesce over shared interests, but it can either be over a solution or over an outcome. And the private sector tends to coalesce around a solution, whereas the voluntary sector tends to coalesce around an outcome, which is much healthier in my view. And I do, for instance, see some unholy alliances on the horizon around hydrogen, as an example. And also, for the avoidance of doubt, because we're often seen as a sort of social enterprise, Riversimple is outright a for-profit company. The express intention is to make more money from doing the right thing than business as usual makes from doing the wrong thing, because this is the surest way to attract capital, to encourage others to copy, and to stimulate change. A central theme in what I'm talking about in all our strategies is aligning interests. And by that, I mean aligning the interests of Riversimple with every stakeholder, every actor in every relationship we build. And this is where the circular economy comes in. And the other key theme I want to talk about is everything we're talking about from the point of view that a step change is now necessary. And what is seen as bold actually reduces risks, reduces barriers, costs, and time. And to do this, whole system design is absolutely critical, optimizing at the system level, because if we try and optimize the elements of the system, we end up pessimizing the whole. Very briefly talk about the cars. This is the car that we've been through 4 generations of vehicle. This is the first one we've designed for use on the public road. We're building a low volume run of these going into a public trial in, well, 2 trials, one in Monmouthshire and one in Pembrokeshire around Milford Haven. It's designed for local use, really, because of the infrastructure challenge. It's our early entry for the technology and so on. It does 0 to 60 in 9.5 seconds, but it doesn't go 65. It just stops at 60. It's a very nippy car to drive up until that point. It does the energy equivalent of a petrol car doing 250 miles to the gallon. And even if we use brown hydrogen, or grey hydrogen as it's now known, from natural gas, we are only 40 grams per kilometre on a well-to-wheel basis. And in terms of step change, we have had the luxury of designing a car from a clean sheet of paper around the characteristics of hydrogen, rather than trying to squeeze hydrogen into a platform that's developed for 100 years around combustion engines. And this is one of those step changes. And by doing so, all the technical barriers really disappear. The auto industry has to, we quite understand, has to squeeze it into the platform they've got, the manufacturing model they've got, the distribution model, the business model. All these things we think have got to change. And the end result is it put a lot of stress on this immature technology. And it's very expensive and difficult, and it's taken a long time to come to market. And this, this is Toyota's hydrogen car. I don't want to be seen to be critical of the industry. I understand why they're doing what they're doing. It's a brilliant bit of engineering, but to my mind, they're solving problems entirely of their own creation. And it has the same acceleration of 0 to 60 in 9.5 seconds. It's a 4-seater, not a 2-seater, so we're not pretending it's equivalent, but the differences are pretty dramatic. It has a fuel cell that's over 13 times as powerful to achieve that, and it uses over 3 times as much hydrogen per mile. They've also, and I can assure you, we've spent rather less than that in getting to this car. But talking about business models is really where I think the barriers are to sustainability. It's not a matter of technology. The technology is all possible. There's some hard engineering grind, but there's no unpredictability to it, and there's no breakthroughs needed. The real barriers are to do with people and politics and inertia. And this is a generic funnel of constraints that we're all facing. And it's principally now resource depletion, climate change, CO2, and the regulatory pressure in response to that. And these constraints in which business operates shape business models. But businesses today are bumping along the walls of this funnel, and it's painful and expensive to stay within those constraints. But it's not surprising, because the profit motive lies way outside the funnel, because these constraints weren't on the radar when the business model of the industry was developed. We were a pinprick on the side of the planet. So natural capital is regarded as infinite, for quite understandable reasons. but it's abundantly not true. They are now the principal constraints. And it's much easier, again, step change, it's much easier to design a business model to deal with the constraints we face than to modify a business model designed to do something fundamentally different. So what we're trying to do is build a business model that turns those constraints into sources of competitive advantage, so that the more sustainable we are, the more profitable we are. And if you sell cars, you make more money by selling more cars. So not only rewarded for resource maximization, resource consumption, but also you're betting your profits against these trends of depletion. So it's not very smart business. And I, for one, don't see how we can ever have a sustainable industrial society based on rewarding industry for the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. So there is a recognition that change is due. The pandemic, the fires in Australia, the fact that we're all talking about we can't go back to business as usual. More and more, there is an awareness that we have to see these levels of change. We were invited to participate in the launch of the Circular Cars Initiative at Davos last year. We've been involved in this over the last year, a lot of workshops, the laudable aim of circularizing the industry by 2030. But there is an awful lot of discussion and a lot of research papers on what needs to be done, but not enough about why. And the why is replaced. In my book, the why is you've got to align the interests of business with the outcomes you're after. But in fact, it's being resolved by having one of the three streams is on policy, which is basically about asking the European Union to impose regulations, because all these doing these things, the what that they're being told to do, is a cost. And so nobody's going to do it until there's a level playing field. And so you need thresholds and mandates. But the trouble is that the industry will only lobby against those regulations. They'll water them down, they'll delay them, and then they'll cheat when they come into force. And to my mind, if you align interests, the regulation isn't necessary, but also it gives a driver to excel, which can never be achieved through a threshold. Once you've got a 95 gram per kilometre tailpipe emission regulation, nobody's going to produce a 94 gram per tailpipe, let alone a 60 gram per kilometre tailpipe emission. And we are always, whenever a new idea comes along, a step change new idea, all the conversation like a lightning rod goes to the reasons why it can't be done. And I accept that generally those reasons are true. But they assume that the new idea is going to replace the old idea in the same context. And the old idea co-evolved in a pattern of relationships with all sorts of other interacting parties. And it's all those relationships that are the reason why the new idea won't work in the old context. And again, a step change. You're prepared to throw away the context and build a new pattern of relationships around a new idea, a new business model, for instance, a new architecture of cars we have done, then suddenly the new idea can look an awful lot more attractive. And this is all a matter of reducing risks and barriers. There's nothing more risky than trying to navigate a step change incrementally. As Lloyd George said, you can't cross a chasm in two leaps. To show just how misaligned our interests are, this is a slightly trite example, but these two cars were made 70 years apart by the same company. And the car on the left did 38 mpg, the car on the right did 38.6 mpg. And you might sort of reasonably expect a little bit more progress in that 70 years, especially when you consider that we've had the oil crisis less than halfway through that period. But not only, we argue that there's no incentive if you sell cars to make a more efficient car. Actually, there's a disincentive. And the reason for that is that to make a more efficient car, it does cost more. It's a more expensive car. But customers will never pay a premium for a more efficient car. They always discount future cost savings almost to zero. And generally, they will go to another customer rather than the person who buys it. Only the first 3 years of savings will go to the first customer. So if the car costs more and the customer won't pay more, it reduces margin. And there is the disincentive to improve efficiency. And this is where we come to regulation again. And we've all seen what happens with regulation, Dieselgate, etc. So we think the biggest change we need to see is not a matter of technology, but of change of business model. We need to make efficiency profitable. And if we did that, we would see a rash of cars doing 100 mpg next month. It's all entirely technically possible. So this is the business model of today, and typically the revenue stream that a manufacturer sees. KPMG's annual report, PwC's annual report on the industry last year put this figure of the lifetime revenues generated by a car. They reckon just under 35% go to the manufacturer of the car, and over 60% go elsewhere. And that percentage is declining as well. If, on the other hand, you move from the sale of product to the sale of service, that's what you see. And this is what we've structured the company for 20 years around, what's now known as mobility as a service. It's a fundamentally circular economy business model. And going back to the Davos initiative, there is still a confusion between recycling and the circular economy. And the idea that cars are going to be scrapped and the percentage of the materials recovered going into new cars, there's no incentive not to go around the circle as fast as possible. And there's no incentive to improve efficiency. Recycling is a very small proportion of the circular economy. And in this model, we would sell a service contract. You'd never buy a car. The contract would cover everything. It would include not just the use of the car, but the maintenance and the fuel, most critically. And at the end of life of the contract, the car comes back to us. We don't sell it into the second-hand trade. We keep it on our books, and we provide to second, a third, or fourth-hand customer. So for the customer, all their cost of motoring is entirely predictable, even if they're the fourth-hand user of the car with a 10-year-old car. They don't bear the risk of a component failure. The car's designed for this model, so we're looking at a 20-year economic life for the car. Average car is 14.5-year life in the UK, and it has no moving parts, so there's other than the wheels. So there's no mechanical wear, no lubricants, no oil changes. All the structural materials are inert, so there's no corrosion. And the components that do degrade, like fuel cells, are designed to be service items. So there's no component that can economically take the car off the road. And we think 20 years is more than achievable. We actually believe there's a much longer tail to the market, the second-hand market, than the industry would have us believe. But critically, there are two features to this that I believe underpin, and they're not talked about, what really make a circular economy business model. And you've got to do both of them to get the maximum benefit, both for the planet, for the customers, and for the business. And that is, one, that the product must stay on the same balance sheet from the clean sheet of paper when you're designing it right through to end of life. And secondly, all costs must be internalized on that same P&L. And if you do that, you build an entirely different car. And it fundamentally breaks down the barriers of bringing the cars to market. If we sell cars, we need to compete with a battery car or a hydrogen car, any new zero-emission car. It costs more to make, and to be competitive in the marketplace, everything's a premium at the moment. You've got to get the supply chain costs down to match those of petrol engines, which are incredibly low. But to get the cost down, you need to get the volume up. On the other hand, if you sell the service, the pricing to the customer is not driven by the build cost of the car. It's driven by the lifetime cost. That includes the build cost, but also all the operating costs and end of life. So at end of life, we design, because we know it's going to be ours, we design for maximum recovery of value. And that's not just raw materials, but components that can be reused. And so that liability, which is considered about 200 euros for the manufacturers at the moment, becomes a credit. We design it for lowest possible operating costs because we're paying for them. We're not making a profit on spare parts. We also have an incentive to improve efficiency because we're paying for the hydrogen. And we design it to maximize the length of their revenue stream because it's a revenue generating asset. And those three things, longer revenue streams, lower operating costs, end of life value recovery, can all offset a higher build cost. So we can come to market long before our supply chain costs match those of petrol engines at the same price to the customer, no premium. We're doing this up through the supply chain. This is the fuel cell, a stack you can see in the left-hand photograph of lots of plates. All those membranes are made by a separate company. Johnson Matthey's a big one. They have on them on the membrane, they have platinum finely divided in customers' hands. The car remains on our balance sheet. We pay the customer. The customer pays us, for the use of the car per month and per mile. we pay for the fuel cell electricity rather than for the fuel cell. We pay for the time we have the inventory in our possession. We pay for the run time because it degrades it, and we pay for the efficiency with which the hydrogen's converted into electricity. They do likewise with the membrane, and we even want Johnson Matthey to lease the platinum off Anglo American. So the mining company can gradually decouple their revenue stream from the extraction of raw materials. It sounds very grandiose to say that, but ultimately that is a mechanism which would logically lead to a mining company stopping mining for good commercial reasons. So I think that really encapsulates everything I want to say about aligning interests with all the partners. We have a shared interest with all our suppliers in the cheapest possible way of delivering the mobility service to the customer. It puts us all on the same page. We can have an open book policy working with our suppliers, getting over the vitriolic relationship at the moment that exists between the manufacturers and the suppliers. It's again alignment of interests with everybody. With customers, our interests are longevity and low running costs rather than obsolescence and high running costs. And it aligns our interests with the environment and with policymakers. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hugo. I guess being the provocative person I am as an activist, I'd argue that maybe we should stop having our own individual cars, that we should favour collective transport instead. And at the same time, you know, it's funny you mentioned Davos, because XR Catalyzers were invited to go to Davos and run some fire circles for these people in power last year. And the first thing I noticed were all these limos and helicopters, and actually the air pollution in that little village was just the highest I've ever experienced. So I guess we do need alternative solutions to what we have today. So I very much value your presentation here, Hugo.
Well,
our speakers so far, so please, Sorry, Hugo, I'll just come back to you. Don't worry. Yes, thank you. So what we're going to do first is go back to land use, and I have a couple of questions for those two speakers, and I'll come back to you, Hugo, after that, talking about transport. So coming back to you, Sue, I have a question here on, second home ownership. I don't know whether you have any views on that, but what do you believe is the best method to reduce second home ownership within the UK? And do you think this would be suitable in London, where a huge amount of the economy case? So what do you think of that?
Absolutely. Second home ownership can be good if you're renting the house out, or I suppose, we do need holiday homes as well. So I guess, provided you are doing that regularly, but many people with their second, third, fourth, fifth homes leave them completely empty, and that's where the sin comes in. And I think so. St Ives specifically said that for all new homes that were being built, they were able to do that, that they had to be for residential purposes, and I think that's quite clever phrasing. That was only for new homes, and I would say that it should be for all homes. Except I don't quite know how you manage the holiday homes, but yeah.
It's difficult to be fair, isn't it? What about these people who already have 2 or 3 homes? It's just yeah. But that I can see why it's
out. If we have this crisis in the supply of homes, but we don't actually have this crisis in the supply of homes. The homes exist. But yeah, it's a matter of sharing them out properly.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I have another one for you. What would you advise someone who wants to live in a net zero home like me? Does it make more sense to retrofit an old house or to rebuild a net zero house instead?
We've got a 1960s house, and we decided to retrofit it. We didn't know that would cost £400,000. At the time, we thought maybe £50,000, which we could have afforded better. And it would clearly have been better to have knocked it down and rebuilt it. And what we have is not a net zero carbon home. It's still using 20,000 kilowatt hours a year just for heating. But it's pretty good. My friend Ian Porritt, who runs Green Core Construction, builds zero carbon homes. Actually, he builds carbon negative homes. And what is really important, and it's something I wanted to ask you, Penelope, about, was this is in the construction phase as well. So building regs and planning don't talk at all about the construction phase, which is when this 100 tons of carbon dioxide gets released. So if you could be building a new home that is carbon negative in its construction and in its operation, then yes, pull down the house you've got. Now, Ian would have all houses pulled down, but then we have an aesthetic issue. We do have an aesthetic issue. We have got some fabulous, beautiful old Victorian homes. It's just really difficult. We were lucky. Ours was 1960s. It was really ugly, so we clad it on the outside, and it now looks much more beautiful than it did at the beginning.
Mm. So how much did you say it cost you, Sue? Because I couldn't hear that properly.
£400,000.
Oh my God, I did hear it well. Woo, did.
And that's where people are talking absolute rubbish about the retrofit costs of things. So, I mean, that's not average. That's a big house, and that includes things like slightly converting the attic. So the actual, if you just take only the carbon aspects of it, like getting more insulation in than you needed to have under building regs, then the uplift is only £60,000.
Yeah.
But then you've got to replaster those walls. You've got to do all of that other stuff because you have done the carbon efficient stuff as well. So I've spoken to a lady in Ealing who works for council and does the retrofit of their council houses. Many of these are just 2-bed flats in blocks, which should be quite warm to start with. She said that on average, it's £40,000 to retrofit each of those places. And that, again, is because it's not just a matter of bunging in a little bit of insulation. It's a matter of really all of the work that goes with, all the finishing that goes with that afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, do you want to comment on that, Penelope, looking from the planning perspective as well that Sue was mentioning?
I don't know a great deal about retrofitting because I'm a planner, not anything to do with building control.
It was really about the construction.
So the point about the construction, in the old days, when I was a young woman and thought that we could change the world, we used to have, and in fact, the council that I worked for at the time did have some what's known in the trade as supplementary guidance that sort of sits below a local plan that took into account all the carbon of embodied energy of construction and the transport and so on and so forth. And I think that's still the case in the BREEAM scheme. So BREEAM, I can't remember what BREEAM stands for, but it's the kite mark system for building more environmentally conscious buildings. It doesn't just deal with energy, it deals with some other things as well. And that also, I think I'm right in saying, takes into account the embodied costs and the transportation costs. But you're absolutely right that it needs to be taken into account. Now, there's a scheme that if I'd been bolder when I was a chief planner and if I'd had a better opportunity, I would have wanted to test, and I don't know if there is still any mileage in this. As a general rule, offsetting is not a good thing because it allows people to continue to emit, as has already been said this morning, when we need to be cutting the emissions in the first place. However, we have all this leaky old housing stock, and building new houses will continue. At what level? I'm not making a comment on whether we need 1 million or whatever, but we will continue to build new homes. And for the time being, things like concrete and steel are going to be very difficult to make carbon neutral, so they will continue to emit carbon. Mm. Now, if you are doing a development scheme, it's quite normal in terms of transport. I'm just going to make an analogy here. In terms of transport, if you want to exit your development into a street that's already congested, you can do things to manage that congestion, to give you headroom to get your cars out of your site. What I don't think has ever been tested, I've never heard of an example anyway, is if you want to build a new home, the home itself will be carbon neutral for its operation once it's built, but you will emit some carbon in building it. Could you then offset that carbon by making existing homes more carbon friendly? And initially, it would be quite a lot cheaper, because the initial measures, the loft insulation, cavity wall insulation, are relatively cheap for the amount of carbon that you get. And then that would allow you to genuinely say, my house is carbon neutral. And it would help us get some money into offsetting, which the government has fantastically failed to do, which again we heard about before the break.
That was done in London.
Let's just move on. Sorry, Sue. Let's just move on to the next question, because I'd just like to move to Penelope now, because we've got quite a few questions from different people. So to make sure we have time for everyone to be able to respond to them. So the other question, Penelope, with all of that was, are there ways, what from your perspective, are there ways to combat the lag within the planning system, which you've highlighted?
It's all the government. Planning is a regulatory system. We are completely dependent on the government to craft the regulations and the guidance. If they change the system, planners change what they do. Currently, there is nothing a bunch of planners can do to speed up the system dramatically, because it's the way the system is organised. And one of the crazy things is with a local plan, so just to give those people on the call an idea, I was chief planner at Wickham District Council in Buckinghamshire. We started the local plan before I became head of planning, and it was at the end of 2012, I think I'm right in saying, and it was adopted in 2019. It's just madness. And we didn't do anything particularly wrong. It's just a bit of a game of snakes and ladders, and new regulations come out and you have to go and retrofit some stuff to carry on. So the way that we deal with the lag in the planning system is for the government to do reforms meaningfully and helpfully, rather than constantly tinkering at the edges, which just makes the thing more complicated and actually slower.
Mm. So there's another perspective that Robin gave us in a question here, Penelope, which was about, I mean, from my perspective, is that we either start from the top, so that's the government, or we can try from the bottom. You know, we grassroots movement, we just do our own take our own initiatives, you know. As, you know, Sue's initiative is a grassroots movement, you know, people taking it into their own hands. So what about councils who've declared net zero carbon by 2030? Robin is highlighting that usually they refer only to scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is fuel and electricity. How might we get them to include scope 3, which would be everything else, including buildings in this case? He quotes the example of the City of London Corporation, and they've identified 2027 for scope 1 and 2 and 2040 for scope 3. And so how might we, you know, persuade other councils to follow suit, to do the same?
And I think it's by the activities of groups like XR and other campaigners, simply making it more increasing the reputational damage that happens if people don't address that issue. I think that's as far as I can work out, that's the only way we're going to get this to go further. I do feel a bit sorry for councils because, again, most of the things that councils could do are caught up in regulations. So bus services, a council outside of London, the way buses are regulated means it's extremely difficult for a council to actually meaningfully run a much more effective bus service to mean that people don't need to drive about in private cars. So the risk is that they become piggy in the middle and the government will pass the buck onto the councils and say, well, they're not doing anything, which they love to do. But it's reputational damage, I think, is the biggest pressure.
In South Oxfordshire, we declared a climate emergency, and we have set a date for 2030 to be zero carbon, not just within the council's own affairs, which is what Oxford County Council has chosen, just to talk about its own affairs, but in the whole of the district. The scoping that we've done is that all domestic fuel and non-domestic fuel, except for industrial processes, will be included. We will include personal transport, freight and railways, but not aviation, waterways and off-road. We will include solid waste disposal, but not wastewater treatment, discharge. So it's just what you've got control of, I think, rather than that what we haven't. And we haven't really got control because it's up to the people in the end to do the district stuff. We can only do things that we're involved with. Which is the thing is that councils are sharing with one another.
Which is never enough, it seems to, isn't it? I mean, we just don't have complete solutions, it seems to me. And the big theme that's coming up for me is responsibility. So, these people have supposed to be having power and influence or responsibilities, but it's not really about responsibilities in the traditional sense. For me, it's becoming more and more the ability to respond to what's needed from me or them, from each of us. So how do we bring this sense of responsibility really is the big question that I keep having when I'm having those conversations with people like that. I'd like to make sure we have time to talk about transport, because I have a couple of interesting questions for you, Hugo, as well. One is, would you consider taking your model to developing nations as a cab service?
Yes, absolutely. We are having conversations with developing nations, and we're not aiming at the elite end of the market that the Teslas of this world are doing. We're aiming at solving the mainstream problem, because I think the Tesla solution might solve something for 1% of the population, but it doesn't really address the problem at all. This relates to your earlier point about car sharing, which I absolutely agree with. And I think we've got far too many cars on the road, and we have far too much investment in road infrastructure. It's always labelled an investment, as Ben Elton once pointed out, whereas anything going into public transport and the rail is a subsidy. What's the difference? It's quite beyond me. But it's not surprising that the company is set up with a sustainability agenda, and our model actually suits car sharing. And it's a sector we really want to support and encourage. If you sell cars, of course, it's a very threatening trend because you sell fewer cars. But we're not selling cars, we're selling mileage. And if you can sell more miles with fewer cars, it's more profitable. So it aligns our business model with that necessary trend. I don't, though, believe that it is the whole answer. And I think there are some people for whom, some users of cars, for whom car sharing doesn't work. And as with most things, really, all of these strategies have a role to play, but they don't solve everything on their own. And so the solution is going to be a more complex mix, and it requires more thinking and some clear-headed thinking, because so much of technology, I believe, is deployed by people who make money from deploying it. And nobody ever makes money from not doing something. So we don't have in our system a wisdom filter to decide whether we should deploy it, or whether how far we should deploy it. And things are routinely pushed way beyond where they should be applied. So, but anyway, yes, our model aligns with both people who need to have the single usership of a car or the car sharing. We would, you asked a question in the chat about whether we'd ever consider selling a car to somebody who really wants to, and the answer is no. We're fairly absolute about that. We want to, I think we probably want to be able to say that we've never sold a car, and we never will. But also, our car would never be competitive. It would be a ludicrous price to the customer. We'd be competing with a top-end BMW, whereas at the moment we're aiming to come to market at the equivalent cost of ownership of a bottom-of-the-range diesel Golf. Although we don't know exactly how much it costs VW to make a Golf, but we think that our projected cost price is about 4 times that of a Golf. But we can still supply it to the customer at the same cost of ownership. So if we were to sell it, we'd be up there with the 60,000, £70,000 BMW. And it's just, it really doesn't work. And the profound impact on the design choices of a product, if you keep it on the balance sheet and internalize all operating costs, is totally underappreciated. And it means that if you have a single model, you can optimize for that model. At the moment, Rolls-Royce famously do power by the hour, selling engine time rather than engines. In fact, they do sell the engine, but they sell the service package with it. And that was so popular that it reached 70% of their sales, 30% where they were just selling the engine straight. But people realized how reliable it was, so it tailed off. And people thought, well, we won't buy the service package, we'll just buy the engine. And it leveled off at about 55%. I mean, the service package gives you peace of mind. But they really need to build a different engine for the two models, but they can't afford to build two different engines. And so it's not optimized for either model. And they have to make it reliable enough to offer under the service package, but cheap enough to build that they can sell it. And we don't want to ever get caught in that trap where you're compromising the lifetime cost driver, which we need to minimize to maximize the sustainable impact. Well, to maximize our progress towards sustainability.
I guess my big problem in all of that we're always talking about money. We're not talking about well-being and, enjoying nature and allowing nature to thrive the way it needs to. It's always kind of very speculative and manipulative somehow, in terms of the way we approach this. And I wonder whether from the housing perspective, that's kind of similar, isn't it? Penelope,
I was thinking as Hugo was speaking about the car and the car service. You don't sell it. Mobility service, not selling a car. One of the problems we have with the housing sector is that we have the business model for house builders, the big house builders. Their incentive is to build the houses as cheaply as possible, and they are not responsible for the ongoing management costs, either repair costs, let alone the energy costs. And perhaps we need to move to a housing services model, which is not rented housing, because that absolutely doesn't work either. Because again, the energy costs aren't borne by the property owner. If you think back to the days before the Industrial Revolution, when things were built, they tended to be built by the person that was going to be using them long term. So they were much more bespoke, and they were responsible for knowing how it was going to last over that whole lifetime. Business model has a lot. I've really appreciated Hugo's talk, because I don't think we talk enough about the business model being the thing that stops us getting to sustainability.
We absolutely talk a lot to people in the building world about how applicable this is to new build. And I believe that by far the best way of improving our building stock and what we do build now is not regulation, but to insist that the developer is responsible for the energy costs for the first 25 years of the life of the building, i.e. the first mortgage. And you'd instantly have a complete building built.
Well, let's have a regulation to say that, and then leave them to it. Yeah,
absolutely.
The other simpler thing that already exists is with district heating, that you actually sell the heat rather than the fuel.
We can't hear you very well, Sue. At least I can't. Would you like to repeat that?
That with district heating, it is the heat that is sold rather than the actual fuel. Can't quite work out how that works with what we were just speaking about, but it does work.
Okay, so to conclude, what I'm going to ask you guys is to think about this. I love the phrase wisdom filter, Hugo, that you used. How might we apply a wisdom filter to all the issues and problems that you've been discussing? What's the solution here? Because for me, it's about behavior and mindsets. How do we change that? Do you have any ideas or suggestions based on your specific subject? How might we bring this wisdom filter for everyone to apply to what they do? Like using this inner, outer wisdom filter. I don't know what it needs to be. Sue, would you like to start?
I think we need to start with the government. That's where the wisdom filter needs to be first of all. And they've got to be not doing everything in order to make money. It's that's where you are with that as well. And when we go back to the how to restore nature, it is fantastic that they've started to talk about it almost as much really as they've started to talk about climate change now. But straight away to go for the profit motive and to talk about investment and making money out of nature is just a worrying trend. So, we've got to get back to the well-being, to the things that really matter, not the GDP that is boosted by by everything bad that you do, really.
Yes. And Hugo, would you have any views on that? I mean, you mentioned the wisdom filter. You muted, Hugo.
I agree with what Sue says. Apart from the government, I think government follows rather than leads, and I think business has far more impact. And I think the biggest single problem we have is very fundamental, and it's the primacy of money, the primacy of the primary fiduciary responsibility to shareholder value, and that is simply not well correlated with the interests of society. So the solution that I propose is I think we need a major change in governance, in corporate governance. We forget that limited liabilities are an enormous privilege, and it's society agreeing to underwrite people wanting to make themselves rich. If it all goes pear-shaped, we'll pick up the tab. Why should we? The only reason we should is because they're doing something in the interest of society. But that bit's been forgotten. There's no obligation to operate in the interest of society, which it needs to be. So in the absence of that, our governance model, we talk about 3 levels of design. There's the product, the business model, the systems, and design level of ideology, which to us is purpose, maintaining the company true to purpose, sustainability as a principle. And so the company is absolutely a for-profit company, but the equity shares have no direct voting rights. There are only 6 voting shares that have no equity rights, and they're held by companies limited by guarantee that represent the investors, the environment, the staff, the customers, the supply chain, and the community. And all 6 are equal. So the board's fiduciary responsibility is to balance and protect those 6 benefit streams. And we absolutely do not believe in monetizing natural capital. But we do believe that the human brain is the best way of finding a balance between the value of clean air, clean water, forests, etc. And putting a price on them will never be the right number. And so the monetary comparison, I don't believe in at all. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a carbon tax to drive behavior in the right way. But actually monetizing natural capital and putting everything into this supposedly rigorous system of the market, I think is completely delusional. And it's simply not going to work. So that governance model where those benefit streams have to be balanced and protected, we think is the best way to address your point about well-being, which absolutely is what has as much voice from the community as the investors do in our company. Our community is represented by Peter Davis, who is the man who was Sustainable Futures Commissioner, who got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act into law in Wales.
Thank you, Hugo. I mean, as XR Catalyzers, we've been talking to investors since November 19, believe it or not, behind doors. And we know we've been influencing, we have been influencing, and we know people are moving and shifting. It's just too slow, it seems, from our perspective. So let's have your view, Penelope, on the wisdom filter. Anything?
So what comes to mind hearing Hugo talk is David Bellamy's saying, we know the price of everything and the value of nothing. In relation to pricing capital. But I think for me, the wisdom filter is what you said at the very beginning, Caroline, which I hadn't thought before, which is crazy because I'm a planner, land use. We treat land as if it's a consumable rather than being its custodian. And if we regarded land as something that we were custodian of, we would have our philosophical approach would be much more lifetime focused rather than immediate short-term gain.
Yes. Thank you, Penelope. So thank you, guys. That was a really interesting session. I'm very happy to have shared it with you. And just to remind people, we're coming to the end of our first day as such. We've got a concert tonight with Belle Roscoe. So go to the website and get your tickets so you'll be able to view it. And we're starting again tomorrow at 9:30 with a scientific perspective. We need to listen to science, finally. I mean, science, has been telling us what we need to be doing for 50 years, literally. And we're just about now to listen to it. So let's have the scientific views and scientific perspective as well here. So thank you, guys, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.